The day begins before the sun is fully risen. In a medieval village, life is ruled by daylight, and the first sign of morning is enough to stir people from their rest. The sound that cuts through the silence of night is often the call of a rooster. It is sharp, insistent, and familiar, echoing across cottages with thatched roofs and narrow dirt paths that wind between them. Almost at once, other signs of life follow. A cow shifts heavily in its stall, releasing a low, steady call for attention. Chickens flutter restlessly, scratching at straw. A dog barks once, then settles again. The village, still wrapped in mist and quiet, begins to stir. For the medieval peasant, dawn is not a moment of leisure. It is the beginning of duty. Every hour of sunlight matters, and in spring and summer, the busiest seasons, the work stretches from first light until the shadows grow long again. Inside a small cottage, a family is already waking. The building is simple, no larger than a single room with a hearth at its center. The air is cool and heavy with the faint smell of smoke from last night's fire. Along one wall lies a heap of straw and clothes where children sleep close together, sharing warmth. Their parents rest nearby, separated by little more than a blanket and a low wooden chest that holds the family's few belongings. The man is first to rise. He stretches stiffly, joints protesting from years of labor. His clothes lie ready near the bed, a coarse woolen tunic, worn thin at the elbows, and trousers patched many times by his wife's hand. The fabric is rough, not comfortable by any modern measure, but it shields him from the cool air. He moves quietly across the dirt floor, stepping over a child's outstretched arm. The boy stirs but does not wake fully. Outside, a rooster calls again, a reminder that the sun is climbing higher even if the sky remains gray. The man's wife is next. She wraps a rough woolen shawl around her shoulders and kneels by the hearth. The embers glow faintly beneath last night's ashes. With practiced hands, she adds kindling and blows gently until sparks catch. Soon, a thin curl of smoke rises, and the small fire begins to warm the room. A clay pot is set upon the stones, filled with water and a handful of oats. The meal will be plain, a thin porridge, perhaps flavored with a pinch of salt if any remains. But it is warm and filling enough to start the day. The children are slower to rise. They rub sleep from their eyes, yawning, stretching, and reluctantly pulling themselves from the straw. Their tunics are simple and often shared among siblings, handed down until no longer usable. The younger ones are tasked with small chores, fetching water, carrying firewood, or scattering grain for the chickens. The older boy, nearing adolescence, will follow his father into the fields. The day begins before the sun is fully risen. In a medieval village, life is ruled by daylight, and the first sign of morning is enough to stir people from their rest. The sound that cuts through the silence of night is often the call of a rooster. It is sharp, insistent, and familiar, echoing across cottages with thatched roofs and narrow dirt paths that wind between them. Almost at once, other signs of life follow. A cow shifts heavily in its stall, releasing a low, steady call for attention. Chickens flutter restlessly, scratching at straw. A dog barks once, then settles again. The village, still wrapped in mist and quiet, begins to stir. For the medieval peasant, dawn is not a moment of leisure. It is the beginning of duty. Every hour of sunlight matters, and in spring and summer, the busiest seasons, the work stretches from first light until the shadows grow long again. Inside a small cottage, a family is already waking. The building is simple, no larger than a single room with a hearth at its center. The air is cool and heavy with the faint smell of smoke from last night's fire. Along one wall lies a heap of straw and clothes where children sleep close together, sharing warmth. Their parents rest nearby, separated by little more than a blanket and a low wooden chest that holds the family's few belongings. The man is first to rise. He stretches stiffly, joints protesting from years of labor. His clothes lie ready near the bed, a coarse woolen tunic, worn thin at the elbows, and trousers patched many times by his wife's hand. The fabric is rough, not comfortable by any modern measure, but it shields him from the cool air. He moves quietly across the dirt floor, stepping over a child's outstretched arm. The boy stirs but does not wake fully. Outside, a rooster calls again, a reminder that the sun is climbing higher even if the sky remains gray. The man's wife is next. She wraps a rough woolen shawl around her shoulders and kneels by the hearth. The embers glow faintly beneath last night's ashes. With practiced hands, she adds kindling and blows gently until sparks catch. Soon, a thin curl of smoke rises, and the small fire begins to warm the room. A clay pot is set upon the stones, filled with water and a handful of oats. The meal will be plain, a thin porridge, perhaps flavored with a pinch of salt if any remains. But it is warm and filling enough to start the day. The children are slower to rise. They rub sleep from their eyes, yawning, stretching, and reluctantly pulling themselves from the straw. Their tunics are simple and often shared among siblings, handed down until no longer usable. The younger ones are tasked with small chores, fetching water, carrying firewood, or scattering grain for the chickens. The older boy, nearing adolescence, will follow his father into the fields. As the man and his son step onto the narrow path that leads toward the open land, the village around them is fully awake. Neighbors are already at work, one man repairing a fence, another leading a donkey toward the manor's granary. Women carry baskets, some headed toward the well to draw water, others toward the communal ovens where bread will be baked later in the day. At the center of the village, the bell of the small church rings once. The sound carries clearly across the rooftops, a reminder of both time and duty. For the peasants, faith is inseparable from daily life. The bell marks not just the hours but the rhythm of prayer and obligation. The man pauses briefly, bowing his head, then continues on his way. The fields stretch wide beyond the cottages, their furrows dark with damp soil. Mist still lingers in the low places, and the air smells strongly of earth. Here, under the open sky, the work of the day will unfold. Every movement of the sun will be matched by the labor of the peasants, their lives bound inseparably to the land. The man rests his hand on the wooden handle of his hoe, feeling its weight, and looks across the land he must tend. His son stands beside him, silent but watchful. The day has only just begun. The path into the fields is narrow, worn by countless feet over countless mornings. The soil beneath is packed firm, and on either side, small ditches run shallow, cut long ago to carry water. The man and his son walk together without words. In this life, there is little need for conversation during routine. The tasks ahead are familiar, repeated every day, every season, and every year. As they approach the open land, the mist thins. Furrows stretch out before them in long rows, some freshly turned, others sprouting with the first fragile signs of growth. The air is damp, cool against the skin, and filled with the smell of soil that has been worked by generations of hands. To the peasant, this ground is everything: his livelihood, his duty, and his survival. The man sets to work with his hoe. The tool bites into the earth, breaking clumps, loosening weeds, and making space for crops to breathe. The rhythm is steady: strike, lift, move forward. Beside him, his son drives small wooden stakes into the ground, tying twine between them to guide beans upward as they grow. The boy's motions are clumsy at times, but the father corrects him with patience. Skill is learned slowly, and every child in the village must one day carry their share of labor. The fields are not quiet for long. Other villagers join, spreading across the land like ants on a hill. Each family tends its own strip, though all are bound together under the authority of the Lord who owns the manor. Men and women work side by side, tools clinking, voices murmuring, and the occasional laugh or call breaking the air. Children too young for heavy work chase each other along the edges, gathering kindling or scaring away birds that swoop toward the grain. The sun climbs higher, burning away the last traces of mist. Its warmth begins to touch the peasants' backs as they bend and straighten, their motions as predictable as the passing of time. Sweat gathers quickly, soaking into woolen tunics, leaving marks of salt upon the fabric. Yet there is no thought of rest. The day is long, and the work must be done while the light holds. At times, the man glances up from his task. In the distance, beyond the fields, the Lord's manor stands tall, its stone walls and timber beams dominating the horizon. It is not a castle, but it is far grander than the cottages of the peasants. The sight is a reminder of duty, for a portion of the harvest will go not to the peasant's family, but to the manor. Taxes, rents, and obligations bind the villagers as tightly as the soil binds the roots of their crops. Still, the work continues. The rhythm of life allows little space for complaint. Each strike of the hoe and each seed pressed into soil is an act of survival, repeated countless times before and countless times yet to come. As the morning stretches on, the sounds of the village grow behind the fields. From the communal oven, the scent of baking bread drifts across the air, warm and inviting. Women gather at the well, drawing buckets of water with steady arms, their voices carrying in conversation. A blacksmith's hammer strikes from somewhere near the center of the village, sharp metallic notes ringing out in steady rhythm. These sounds weave together into a tapestry of life, ordinary, simple, and enduring. Near midday, the man pauses briefly. His back aches, his hands are rough and raw, but he allows himself a moment to straighten, wipe sweat from his brow, and look across the land. The fields stretch wide, dotted with peasants bent to their labor, each one part of the same unending effort. Above, the sun shines clear and strong, marking the passage of hours. His wife approaches from the village, a small bundle wrapped in cloth carried in her hands. She brings food for the family: coarse bread, a piece of cheese, perhaps an onion or two. The children gather eagerly when she arrives, sitting together on the edge of the field. There is no table, no ceremony, only a pause in work to eat. They break the bread into pieces, passing it carefully to ensure each has a share. The cheese is divided, the onion sliced, and water is drunk from a shared flask. It is not a feast, but it is sustenance. For the peasant, that is enough. The meal is brief. There is no time for a long rest, and the sun will not wait. Soon, the family returns to work, bending again to the soil, hands moving steadily as before. The fields demand attention, and attention they receive. Beyond the village, nature stirs as well. Birds move restlessly through the hedgerows, their wings flashing as they dart from branch to branch. Insects hum low over the grass. A breeze passes across the land, carrying with it the scent of tilled soil, smoke from cooking fires, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers growing at the edges of the fields. These details often go unnoticed by the peasants, their focus locked on survival, yet they form the constant background of life. Hours pass in quiet labor. The rhythm of the hoe, the murmur of voices, the cluck of chickens wandering near the edges of the fields all blend into a steady hum. The man works without pause, driven by the knowledge that every wheat pulled, every furrow tended, brings his family closer to surviving another season. His son, though weary, continues at his side, learning not just the work itself, but the endurance required to sustain it. From time to time, the sound of the church bell carries across the village. It rings at set intervals, marking not only the time of day but the presence of faith. Each toll is a reminder that life is lived under the eyes of God, that the struggles of the field are part of a greater order. The peasants bow their heads briefly, whispering a prayer before returning to their labor. Faith offers structure, hope, and meaning, even when the body is worn and the future uncertain. By the time the sun reaches its highest point, the morning has passed into the afternoon. Muscles ache, skin burns beneath the sun, and the fields are heavy with the weight of human effort. The land has been tended, but much remains. The peasants know that tomorrow will bring the same dawn, another round of labor, another chapter in the endless cycle of survival. For now, though, the man pauses once more. He stands tall, stretching his back, and gazes across the field. His wife works a short distance away, her hands steady as she weeds between rows of crops. His son leans on his stake, breathing heavily, face red from exertion. The youngest children play near the cottage, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. It is an ordinary day, like countless others before it. Yet within its simplicity lies the truth of medieval life, a life defined not by great events or grand stories, but by the steady, unbroken rhythm of dawn, labor, and dusk. This is how the day begins. This is the dawn over the fields. Bread and porridge. Food was never simply food in the medieval village. It was survival, identity, and often the line between life and death. In the world of peasants, where wealth was measured in land worked and harvest gathered, meals were not chosen for variety or pleasure, but shaped by necessity. Day after day, year after year, one truth held steady: bread and porridge were the foundation of life. Without them, the medieval peasant could not endure. The story of bread and porridge is, in many ways, the story of the peasant himself. Grain was the currency of existence, more precious than coin, more essential than meat or vegetables. It filled stomachs, fueled bodies for labor, and offered some sense of stability in a world filled with hardship and uncertainty. To understand what it meant to live as a peasant, one must first understand what it meant to eat as one. The morning porridge. The day begins with the smell of smoke rising through the low rafters of the cottage. The fire is coaxed back to life with small sticks, then fed with logs until it glows warm and steady. Over the hearth, a clay pot swings from an iron hook. Into it goes water drawn from the village well and a handful of rough grain barley, rye, or oats, depending on what the family has managed to store. The grains are coarse, often ground unevenly on a hand mill, leaving sharp fragments that never quite soften even after long boiling. The porridge thickens slowly, bubbling with a low hiss. The woman of the house stirs with a long wooden spoon, keeping the mixture from sticking to the sides. There is little to add for flavor. Perhaps a pinch of salt if the family can afford it, or a splash of milk in good seasons when the cow yields more. Honey, fruit, or herbs are rare luxuries, kept for feast days or when a neighbor is generous. For most mornings, it is just grain and water, transformed by fire into a simple meal. Children gather near the fire, wooden bowls in hand, waiting for their share. They know better than to complain. Hunger is a companion too familiar to tempt, and the steaming porridge is better than an empty belly. The mother ladles carefully, dividing portions with an eye trained by years of experience. The father receives his share last, sometimes taking less so the younger ones have more. They eat quickly, heads bent over bowls, the only sound the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough from smoke lingering in the air. The taste is plain, almost dull. But the warmth fills the stomach, replacing hunger with a temporary comfort. It will not last long. By midday the ache will return, but it is enough to start the long hours of labor ahead. The bowls are wiped clean, the pot scraped so that no grain goes to waste. Even the thin crust at the bottom is eaten or softened later with water. Nothing is ever discarded. This routine repeats every morning, with little variation. For the peasant family, porridge is not just a meal, it is the rhythm of survival itself. Bread in peasant life. If porridge filled the mornings, bread was the anchor of every other meal. To bake bread was to transform grain into something more sustaining, something that could be carried into the fields or stored for days. Yet bread was not simple to make. It began with grain, and grain itself required backbreaking work. After the harvest, wheat, rye, or barley was stored in sacks or bins, protected as best as possible from dampness and pests. Each day, the family ground enough to last. For flour could not be kept fresh for long. Grinding was a slow, exhausting task. In most cottages, women used a hand mill of two heavy circular stones with a hole in the center where the grain was poured. The upper stone was turned by hand, back and forth, crushing the kernels into metal. Hour after hour, shoulders ached and arms burned as the stone groaned in its rhythm. The result was never fine flour, but a coarse, gritty meal that carried into the bread itself. The dough was mixed in wooden bowls, flour blended with water, sometimes a bit of sourdough starter saved from the last baking. Salt, if available, was precious. The dough was kneaded by hand, sticky and heavy, then set aside to rise. Yeast was not purchased in packets as it is today, it lived in the air, in the environment of the cottage itself. If the dough rose well, the bread would be lighter. If not, the result was a dense, hard loaf. Either way, it would be eaten. Most peasants did not own an oven of their own. Baking required heat that only large stone ovens could provide, and these were often communal. In many villages, a baker or the manor's oven served everyone. Families carried their dough to be baked, paying with a small portion of flour or loaves as a fee. Smoke and heat rolled out of the oven as loaves slid in on wooden paddles, rows of bread transforming under the heat of fire. The smell of baking spread through the village, rich and earthy, a brief reminder of abundance even in lean times. When the bread was ready, it was divided with care. Small loaves might vanish quickly in the hands of children, but larger rounds were cut into pieces, shared through the day. Bread accompanied every meal, dipped into porridge, eaten with cheese when available, or simply chewed on its own while laboring in the fields. It was tough, sometimes heavy, but it was filling. To eat bread was to eat life itself. Scarcity and hunger. Yet bread and porridge could not always be counted on. Harvests failed. Grain spoiled. Famine arrived like a shadow, settling over the village with merciless hunger. In those years, the memory of fresh loaves or steaming porridge became cruel reminders of what was lost. Families stretched their stores as long as possible, thinning porridge with more water, baking loaves with less grain. When grain ran short, substitutes appeared. Peas, beans, chestnuts, or acorns were ground into meal, mixed into bread that grew harder and more bitter with every bite. Weeds from the fields, nettles, and roots were boiled into gruel. Some families boiled bark or chewed on dried grass stems, anything to silence the growling of their stomachs. These desperate meals filled bellies but weakened bodies. Over time, malnutrition left its mark, and famine claimed lives. The fear of hunger never fully left. Even in good years, when granaries were full, peasants remembered the lean times. Every crumb of bread was treated with respect. Every grain valued. Food was survival, and survival could not be taken for granted. Seasonal foods and variations. Though bread and porridge dominated, the meals of peasants did shift with the seasons. In summer, when fields yielded vegetables and fruits, porridge might be flavored with berries, apples, or wild herbs. Milk was more plentiful, butter could be churned, and eggs gathered. These small additions brought variety and a brief richness to meals. Winter, however, stripped the diet back to its bones. Stored grain, salted meat if it was available, dried beans, and root vegetables made up the cold months. Porridge grew thinner, bread harder. Cheese aged from the summer might still be eaten, but slowly and sparingly. Hunger pressed closer in the dark months, when fields lay bare and the memory of green abundance felt like a dream. The symbolism of bread. Bread was not only food. It was sacred. In the Christian faith that shaped medieval life, bread carried profound meaning. At Mass, bread became the body of Christ, the holiest of symbols. To peasants, who ate bread daily, this gave their simplest food a sense of spiritual weight. But bread also represented duty. A portion of every harvest, every loaf, went as tithe to the church. Another share went to the lord of the manor, a reminder that the fruits of their labor were not theirs alone. Only what remained fed the peasant family. To eat bread was to taste not only the grain of the field, but the structure of medieval society itself. The communal table. Meals in the peasant household were not grand affairs, but they were central moments of family life. Everyone gathered around the table or sat on stools near the hearth. Bowls were shared, spoons passed down from one generation to another. There was little ceremony, but there was togetherness. Children learned to eat quickly, not wasting time. Manners were simple but firm, no food was to be dropped, no portion taken greedily. The family that ate together also survived together, and the meal reminded them of that bond. Neighbors sometimes shared food, especially in hard times. A widow might receive a loaf from a family with a little extra. On feast days, when the Lord provided meat or ale, the village gathered to celebrate, their laughter and voices filling the air with rare joy. Reflections on daily meals. Bread and porridge may seem plain by modern standards, but in the life of a medieval peasant, they were everything. They gave strength for the fields, comfort in hunger, and a rhythm to days and seasons. They tied the family together, and they bound the peasant to his Lord, his church, and his God. To live as a peasant was to live close to the land, bound to the grain it produced. Every morning bowl of porridge, every hard-crusted loaf of bread, was a reminder of survival. And in that survival, peasants found meaning, resilience, and the strength to carry on from one day to the next. Work in the fields. The medieval village was built on one truth: without the fields, there could be no life. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of porridge, every handful of beans or onions came from the soil. For the peasant, the field was not just a place of labor. It was the center of existence, a landscape that demanded strength, patience, and endless hours of work. The rhythm of the field was the rhythm of life itself. To step into the fields each morning was to step into an ancient cycle, older than memory. Seasons turned, crops rose and fell, and year after year, peasants bent their backs to the earth, knowing that their survival, and the survival of their families, depended entirely on the harvest. This chapter will follow that rhythm: the seasons of the peasants' labor, the tools they carried, the struggles they endured, and the unbreakable tie between human life and the land beneath their feet. The rhythm of the seasons. Peasant work in the fields was never random. Every task, every movement, was shaped by the turning of the year. Time itself was measured not in hours on a clock, but in the demands of the earth. In spring, the fields came alive again. Plowing, harrowing, sowing, these were the tasks that demanded energy after the long winter. Men and women worked side by side, scattering seed by hand, following behind plows drawn by oxen, ensuring that every strip of land was used. In summer, the crops grew. Work shifted to weeding, maintaining hedges, repairing tools, and preparing for the harvest ahead. The fields shimmered with green, then gold, as the grain ripened. In autumn, the great work arrived. Harvest was the climax of the year, the moment everything depended on. Whole families poured into the fields, cutting, binding, stacking, and storing the crop. It was exhausting, but it was also the season of hope, when barns and granaries filled, and the fear of hunger receded at least for a while. In winter, the fields rested, but the peasants did not. Animals needed feeding, tools needed mending, and what little pasture remained had to be carefully managed. Snow covered the ground, but the work of survival continued. The peasant's calendar was not written on parchment. It was etched into the soil itself. Tools of the peasant. Peasant labor in the fields relied on simple tools, many unchanged for centuries. A plow was the most important, though not every family owned one. Heavy and expensive, it was often shared among several households or provided by the Lord. Pulled by oxen, the plow turned the soil, breaking the earth so seeds could be sown. Where land was lighter, a wooden yard, a simpler plow, might be used instead. After plowing came the harrow, a frame of wood or iron teeth dragged across the soil to break clumps and smooth the surface. Sowing followed, seeds cast by hand from a bag slung over the shoulder, scattered with long, practiced sweeps. When harvest came, the sickle and the scythe were the tools of choice. The sickle, with its short curved blade, allowed careful cutting of grain stalks. The scythe, longer and more powerful, could mow down wider swaths. Bundles of grain were tied into sheaves, then stacked into shocks to dry. Finally, the flail was used to thresh the grain, beating kernels free from stalks on barn floors. None of these tools were luxurious. Handles splintered, blades dulled, and repairs were constant. A peasant's tools were his lifeline, and to lose them was to lose the ability to survive. Sowing the seeds. The sowing of grain was an act of faith as much as labor. Each seed held the hope of survival, and scattering it into the earth meant trusting that the soil, the rain, and the sun would do their part. Men walked the fields with slow, measured steps, casting handfuls of seed in broad arcs. Behind them, others followed, covering the seeds lightly with soil, protecting them from birds. Children chased after, scaring away crows that tried to swoop down. Sowing was not a time for idleness. Every day lost meant a weaker harvest. The Lord's reeve, appointed to oversee work, often walked the boundaries, ensuring that peasants met their obligations. Fields were not just for the peasant family, but for the manor as a whole. Each strip of land represented a portion of rent owed, labor expected, and survival for all. When the sowing was complete, villagers often prayed together. They knew how fragile their efforts were. Too much rain, too little sun, a sudden storm or a swarm of pests, any of these could ruin months of work. The act of sowing was always heavy with hope, fear, and the memory of past failures. Summer toil. As crops grew, peasants turned their labor to maintaining them. Weeding was constant, pulling up unwanted plants that competed with grain. Fences and hedges were checked, repaired, or rebuilt, keeping animals from trampling the precious shoots. Summer also brought other tasks. Hay had to be cut and dried for winter fodder. Pastures had to be managed, ensuring animals had enough to graze without destroying the land. Streams and ditches were cleared to keep water flowing, preventing flooding that could drown crops. Long days under the sun meant aching muscles, sweat-soaked clothing, and sunburnt skin. Work began at dawn and ended only when light failed. Yet there was little complaint. The survival of winter depended on the work of summer. The harvest. Harvest time was the heart of the peasant year. From dawn until dusk, the fields filled with movement. Men swung scythes in wide arcs, cutting golden grain. Women and children followed, gathering stalks into bundles, binding them with straw. Songs sometimes rose in the fields, steady rhythms that helped the work continue, but more often there was only the swish of blades and the rustle of stalks falling. The work was exhausting. Hands blistered, backs bent, feet ached. Yet the urgency never lessened. Every day mattered, for grain left too long in the field could be ruined by sudden storms. When the grain was gathered into sheaves, it was stacked into small pyramids left to dry under the sun. Later, wagons carried them to barns, where threshing began. With flails, peasants beat the stalks until kernels fell free, then winnowed them by tossing grain into the air, letting the wind carry away chaff. Finally, the grain was measured, and dues collected. The Lord's share came first, followed by the tithe to the church. What remained was stored carefully, sealed in bins or sacks, guarded against damp and vermin. For the peasant, the sight of full granaries was the closest thing to security they could know. Winter tasks. Winter brought no crops to tend, but the work never stopped. Animals had to be fed and kept warm. Fences were repaired, tools sharpened, barns cleaned. Firewood had to be gathered, carried, and stacked. Inside cottages, women spun wool, wove cloth, and mended clothing. Men repaired harnesses, carts, and plows. Children carried water, fetched straw, and tended animals. The rhythm of labor slowed, but it never ceased. The fields themselves slept, covered by frost or snow. Peasants looked out across the land, waiting for spring to return. But even in winter, they knew their survival depended on what they had done in the fields the year before. Hardships of the fields. Fieldwork was relentless and often dangerous. Injuries were common: cuts from sickles, crushed hands from heavy loads, broken bones from accidents with animals or carts. Illness spread easily in damp barns or crowded cottages, and hunger weakened the body's ability to resist. Weather was the greatest enemy. A flood could drown fields in a day. A drought could wither crops before they ripened. A late frost could destroy seedlings, and hail could flatten entire harvests in a single storm. The peasants had no protection against these forces. They endured them, prayed against them, and bore the consequences when nature turned cruel. The bond between peasant and land. Despite the hardships, the peasant's bond with the land was unbreakable. It was not love, in the modern sense, but necessity. To know the soil, its strengths and weaknesses, was to know life itself. Parents taught children which fields dried quickest after rain, which slopes held frost longest, which valleys yielded the best grain. The land shaped the peasant's body, calloused hands, strong backs, skin weathered by wind and sun. It shaped the mind as well, instilling patience, endurance, and resilience. To be a peasant was to live in constant negotiation with the earth, knowing it could both nourish and destroy. Reflections on work in the fields. When we look back on the life of the medieval peasant, it is easy to see only hardship. Endless toil, little rest, meager reward. Yet in the fields, peasants found more than suffering. They found meaning in the survival of their families, dignity in labor shared across generations, and a rhythm that tied them to the great cycle of seasons. Work in the fields was not glamorous, but it was the foundation of life. Every grain harvested, every seed sown, carried the weight of survival. Without it, there would be no bread, no porridge, no village at all. The medieval peasant may not have had wealth or power, but in their fields, they held the most essential gift of all, the power to endure. Feasts and famine. In the medieval world, food was never simply food. It was joy and sorrow, power and weakness, survival and despair. A loaf of bread might mean life. An empty cupboard might mean death. To live in a medieval village was to walk a narrow path between plenty and hunger, where each season could bring celebration or catastrophe. The rhythm of the fields governed daily existence, but how food was shared and consumed revealed much about medieval life. At times, there were festivals and feasts, moments of abundance when tables sagged beneath roasted meats, fresh bread, and overflowing jugs of ale. Laughter rose into the night, music played, and villagers savored the rare taste of plenty. But just as often, the shadow of famine loomed. Crops failed, stores ran dry, and winter dragged on longer than expected. Hunger gnawed at bellies, weakened bodies, and stole children in silence. Peasants lived between these extremes, always aware that fortune could turn with the weather, with war, or with the will of God. This chapter will explore both faces of medieval food, the joy of feasts and the despair of famine. The nature of a feast. For the medieval peasant, a feast was more than just a meal. It was a rare moment when hunger loosened its grip, when the hardships of labor could be forgotten, if only for a night. Feasts might be tied to the church calendar, marking Christmas, Easter, or saints' days. They might also follow the rhythms of the village year, a wedding, a successful harvest, or a great fair. A typical feast began with preparation. Animals were slaughtered, bread was baked, and ale was brewed in larger batches than usual. Neighbors brought what they could contribute, from cheese and onions to small cuts of pork or mutton. For the Lord's household, feasts were grander affairs, showcasing wealth with roasted boars, spiced dishes, and imported wine. Tables were set not with plates but with trenchers, thick slices of bread that doubled as serving dishes. Food was piled high, stews, roasted birds, boiled vegetables, wheels of cheese, and sometimes even pastries if the cook had access to sugar or honey. Music often accompanied the feast. Minstrels, fiddlers, or simple drums gave rhythm to the gathering. Storytellers might recite tales, weaving together history and myth, while dancers moved in circles on the packed earth floor. For peasants, a feast was as much about community as about food. Hunger was easier to bear when shared, but abundance was sweeter when celebrated together. The Lord's table. To truly understand the contrast of medieval eating, one must imagine the Lord's feast. Where peasants shared simple stews, the Lord dined on exotic foods that peasants could scarcely imagine. The great hall of a castle or manor was the stage. Tables stretched the length of the room, covered with cloths, candles flickering above. Servants moved constantly, carrying platters of roasted swan, venison, or peacock, their feathers sometimes reattached for display. Spices from faraway lands flavored dishes, cinnamon, ginger, saffron. These were treasures worth their weight in gold. Guests drank from goblets of silver, and wine flowed freely. Music echoed from the gallery, and jugglers, fools, or musicians entertained between courses. For the Lord, feasting was not merely about food, but about demonstrating wealth and power. The abundance itself was a statement: here, hunger has no place. Peasants might glimpse such feasts only when serving, carrying trenchers to tables or clearing scraps. For them, it was a world apart, a reminder of the gulf between those who labored and those who ruled. Feasts of the Church. The Church, too, held its own rhythm of eating. Fasts alternated with feasts, shaping the diet of all Christians. Days of fasting often forbade meat, leading peasants to rely on fish, eggs, or vegetables. Yet when feast days arrived, restrictions lifted, and the tables filled again. Christmas brought roasted meats, spiced puddings, and special loaves of bread baked with care. Easter is celebrated with lamb, symbolizing sacrifice and renewal. Saints' days often meant local festivals, with music, markets, and shared meals. For the peasant, these holy feasts were eagerly awaited. They broke the monotony of daily meals and allowed even the poorest to taste something rare. Feasting became an act of faith as well as joy, a reminder of God's bounty in a world where hunger was never far away. The shadow of famine. Yet for every feast, there was the specter of famine. In the medieval world, famine was not rare. Failed harvests, harsh winters, wars that trampled fields, any of these could strip a village bare. When food stores dwindled, diets shrank to their simplest form. Bread made from rye or barley, often stretched with beans or even ground acorns. Thin broth flavored with little more than cabbage or turnip. Milk watered down, cheese rationed, meat almost non-existent. Hunger weakened the body. Children grew frail, the elderly wasted away, and disease spread easily through underfed households. Entire villages might see their numbers dwindle in a single bad year. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is remembered as one of the darkest periods. Endless rain drowned fields, grain rotted, and livestock perished. People ate what they could find: roots, grass, bark. Chronicles speak of desperation, of theft, and of families forced to wander in search of food. Some accounts even whisper of darker acts, when starvation pushed humanity to its limits. Famine was more than a lack of food. It was the collapse of security, the unraveling of daily life, the reminder that survival was always uncertain. Coping with scarcity. Peasants developed strategies to endure lean times. Food was carefully stored in granaries, cellars, and lofts, sealed against damp and guarded against rats. Salted meats, dried fish, hard cheese, and preserved fruits stretched supplies through winter. Communities often helped one another. Neighbors shared what little they had, churches distributed alms, and lords sometimes opened their stores to prevent rebellion. Yet generosity could only go so far. When scarcity deepened, even bonds of community strained under the weight of hunger. Peasants also relied on knowledge of wild foods, herbs, berries, mushrooms, and roots. Children were sent into forests and hedgerows to gather what could be found. While these foods could not replace grain or meat, they offered small relief in desperate times. The emotional weight of hunger. For the medieval peasant, hunger was not just physical. It carried a heavy emotional toll. To watch a child cry from emptiness, to see a neighbor waste away, to face another long winter with dwindling stores left scars deeper than the body. Hunger also shaped belief. Many saw famine as punishment, a trial sent by God to test faith or remind humanity of its dependence. Prayers and processions filled the fields, begging for rain or for sun. Bells rang through villages, calling people to repentance. Hunger was a communal suffering, and so it was met with communal pleas. Yet hunger also bred resilience. Those who survived learned to endure, to adapt, to find strength in the smallest comforts, a warm fire, a shared crust, a neighbor's kindness. In famine, the bonds of community were tested, and though they sometimes broke, they often held. The contradiction of abundance and scarcity. The medieval world was a place of stark contradiction. On one side, glittering feasts in great halls, where meat dripped with fat and goblets overflowed with wine. On the other, cottages where a family huddled over a thin broth, counting the days until spring. This contrast was not lost on the peasants. They served the feasts of their lords, carried trays heavy with food they could never taste, and returned home to empty tables. Hunger and abundance lived side by side, separated only by walls of stone and lines of power. Feasts and famine were not opposites, but part of the same cycle. Together, they defined medieval life, reminding all who lived within it of the fragility of survival. Reflections on feasts and famine. To walk through a medieval village was to walk between two worlds. One of joy, where laughter rose over shared meals, and one of sorrow, where silence spoke of hunger. Both shaped the people who lived there. Feasts gave relief, binding communities together, offering moments of happiness that cut through the struggle. Famine brought despair, but also endurance, teaching lessons of resilience and humility. The medieval peasant lived always in this balance, never secure, never entirely hopeless. Food was life, and life was fragile. In the glow of a feast or the darkness of famine, one truth remained: in the medieval world, survival was the greatest victory of all. Inside the medieval home. In the medieval world, the home was more than just shelter. It was the center of family life, the place where meals were cooked, where children were born and raised, and where work carried on when the fields could not be tilled. To modern eyes, the peasant's home may seem small, smoky, and bare, but within those simple walls lay the heart of daily survival. This chapter takes us inside the medieval cottage, examining not only what it looked like, but what it felt like to live there. We will step into its rooms or more often, its single room, and experience the warmth, the discomforts, and the rhythms that define family life. The structure of the peasant's cottage. Most peasant homes were built with the materials closest at hand. Wood, wattle, and daub formed the walls, while thatch covered the roof. Stone might be used in regions where it was plentiful, but for most villagers, stone houses were beyond reach. The size of the home varied, but many cottages were small, often no more than a single large room, perhaps with a loft or partition. Floors were usually beaten earth, packed down by years of footsteps. In wetter areas, straw was scattered across the floor to soak up moisture and provide insulation. Roofs of thatch hung low, shedding rain but also attracting mice, insects, and birds. Smoke drifted upward toward the roof, seeping out through gaps, for many cottages lacked chimneys. The air inside was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, a constant reminder of the hearth at the center of the home. The hearth, the heart of the home. At the center of every cottage was the hearth. It was not only the source of warmth but also the place where food was cooked and light was provided during the long nights. A fire was kept burning as often as possible, for relighting it could be difficult, and smoke filled the room whenever green wood or damp straw was burned. Above the fire hung a pot, suspended from an iron hook or chain. Here, stews simmered slowly, fed with whatever grains, vegetables, or scraps of meat the family had. Bread was baked on flat stones or in communal ovens shared by the village. The smell of boiling cabbage or onions often mingled with the acrid tang of smoke, creating a scent both familiar and inescapable. Around the hearth, the family gathered. Meals were eaten here, stories were told, and warmth was shared on cold nights. The hearth was the living room, the kitchen, and in some ways, the soul of the home. Light and darkness. Lighting within the medieval home was minimal. By day, sunlight filtered through small windows if there were any. Many cottages had none at all, relying on the open doorway or small slits in the wall to admit light. At night, the fire provided the only glow. Candles were precious, made from tallow or beeswax, and were saved for special occasions. Rushlights reeds dipped in fat provided a cheaper alternative, though they burned quickly and filled the room with a greasy odor. Darkness was a constant presence. Once the sun set, the cottage grew dim, and tasks that required detail became impossible. Families adjusted their lives to the rhythm of light, rising early with dawn and retreating to bed soon after dusk. Furniture and household objects. Inside the peasant's home, furniture was sparse. A table, rough-hewn from wood, served as the center for eating and work. Benches or stools provided seating, though many simply sat on the floor. Beds, when they existed, were wooden frames filled with straw or reeds, covered with blankets of wool or fur. Many peasants slept directly on piles of straw, sharing space with family members for warmth. In some cottages, animals were kept inside during winter, their body heat helping to warm the family and their presence a reminder of how closely human and animal life were intertwined. Storage was minimal. A chest might hold clothing or treasured possessions. Pots, pans, and wooden bowls were hung from hooks or placed on shelves. Tools leaned against walls, ready to be carried back to the fields. Every object served a purpose. There was little space, and nothing went to waste. Smells, sounds, and atmosphere. To step inside a medieval cottage was to encounter a world of scents and sounds. The smoke of the hearth hung in the air, stinging eyes and clinging to clothing. The earthy smell of damp straw mixed with the odors of animals, cooking food, and unwashed bodies. Children's laughter echoed, mingled with the cries of infants or the lowing of a cow brought inside. The crackle of fire was constant, broken by the clatter of wooden bowls or the sharp sound of iron tools striking wood. At night, the home grew quieter, but never silent. The creak of timbers, the rustle of mice in the thatch, the shifting of animals in the corner all were reminders that life surrounded the family even in rest. Family life inside the home. The cottage was crowded. Families often numbered 5, 6, or more, and space was shared without privacy. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents lived together in a single room. Beds, if separate, were crowded side by side. Daily life revolved around survival tasks. Women spun wool, mended clothes, and prepared meals. Men repaired tools or fashioned new ones. Children played, but also carried out small chores, fetching water or gathering firewood. The home was a school of life. Skills were passed down here, not in classrooms but at the hearthside. Songs, prayers, and stories filled the air, carrying culture from one generation to the next. The loft and storage spaces. In some cottages, a loft was built beneath the thatched roof. Accessed by a ladder, it provided extra sleeping space or storage. Grain, dried herbs, or tools might be kept there, safe from damp floors and gnawing animals. For children, the loft was often a sleeping place, tucked under the beams, warm in summer and stifling in winter. Parents might keep infants near the fire, where warmth was more reliable. Though simple, these spaces allowed families to make the most of their small homes. The home as workplace. The medieval home was also a place of work. Spinning wheels, looms, and tools often crowded the same space where meals were eaten and sleep was taken. Women brewed ale or churned butter. Men repaired harnesses or sharpened tools. In winter, when the fields lay idle, indoor tasks filled the days. Children learned by watching and helping. A daughter might be taught to card wool beside her mother, while a son practiced carving wood beside his father. The home was a workshop as much as a dwelling, every corner filled with the tasks of survival. Guests and gatherings. Though small, the peasant's home was sometimes open to neighbors. A shared meal, a visit from kin, or the presence of a traveling priest might draw villagers together. Benches were pulled close, food was stretched to feed one more, and stories filled the smoky air. Hospitality was valued, even in poverty. To welcome a guest was a duty, though the meal might be simple: a bowl of porridge, a hunk of bread, a mug of ale. The warmth of company mattered more than the richness of the fare. Illness and death in the home. Life and death unfolded within these walls. Illness was treated at home, with herbs, prayers, and the care of family. There were no hospitals for peasants, and doctors were rare. Births took place in the same space where meals were eaten, guided by midwives and the experience of older women. Death, too, was faced at home. A body might be laid out on the table, candles burning beside it, before being carried to the churchyard. The home held every stage of life, from first breath to last. Safety and danger. The cottage offered protection from the elements, but dangers remained. Fire was a constant threat, for thatch burned quickly. Theft was rare within a tight-knit village, but travelers or raiders sometimes brought fear. Animals indoors could bite or spread disease, and poor ventilation made sickness more likely. Yet for all its risks, the home was a sanctuary. Within its walls, peasants found security, warmth, and belonging. The meaning of home. For the medieval peasant, home was never just a building. It was the heart of family life, the place where laughter, struggle, and faith came together. It was humble, often uncomfortable, but it was theirs. Amid the smoky air, the crowded space, and the simple furnishings, life carried on. Meals were shared, children grew, and generations endured. In its simplicity lay resilience, for these homes sheltered not just bodies, but the spirit of medieval village life. Closing reflection. To modern eyes, the medieval peasant's home may seem bare and harsh. Yet for those who lived within, it was enough. It was a place of warmth in winter, shade in summer, and community in all seasons. Its walls heard stories, laughter, prayers, and sorrows. Inside the medieval home, life was fragile, but it was also deeply human. Here, amid smoke and straw, the heart of the Middle Ages beat strongest. Faith and the village church. Faith was not a choice in the medieval world. It was the very air that people breathed, the rhythm by which their lives were measured, the compass that guided their days and explained their nights. For the villagers who lived in cottages of wood and thatch, faith was not distant or abstract. It was close, familiar, and ever-present, embodied in one simple yet powerful place, the village church. The church was more than just a building for worship. It was the center of community life, the anchor of the calendar, and the bridge between this world and the next. Its bell marked the hours, its festivals marked the seasons, and its priests provided the words and rituals that gave meaning to joy and sorrow alike. In this chapter, we will step into the churchyard, cross the threshold of the medieval church, and experience the atmosphere within. We will explore the role of faith in daily life, the importance of ritual and festival, and the way the church shaped every birth, every death, and everything in between. The church building. In most medieval villages, the church was the largest and most solid building. While cottages leaned with age and barns crumbled under storms, the church stood firm. Constructed from stone where possible, it rose above the village, its tower visible from the fields. For peasants, the church represented permanence. Generations might live and die in the same cottages, rebuilt again and again, but the church remained. Its walls seemed eternal, a reflection of the eternal God it was built to honor. Inside, the church was cool and dim. Light filtered through small windows, sometimes filled with colored glass that painted soft patterns on the floor. The scent of incense, wax, and stone filled the air. Wooden pews or benches were rare in earlier centuries. Most villagers stood through services, or knelt directly on the stone floor. At the far end stood the altar, the most sacred place. Behind it, painted images or carved statues of saints watched over the faithful. Every object had meaning, and every gesture within those walls connected the villager to mysteries far greater than themselves. The sound of bells. Perhaps the most familiar part of church life was the bell. Its sound carried across the fields, calling people to prayer, marking hours, and announcing births, deaths, or danger. When the bell tolled, peasants laid down their tools. Its deep sound echoed across meadows and villages, a reminder that time was not measured by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythms of faith. The bell called people to Mass on Sundays. It rang to warn of fire or attack. It tolled solemnly when a villager died, and joyfully on feast days. For many, its sound was as constant as the rising and setting of the sun. The priest. At the heart of the church stood the priest. His role was more than spiritual. He was a teacher, judge, and guide. He read the Latin scriptures that few could understand, but through him, the villagers heard God's word. The priest baptized newborns, blessed marriages, and buried the dead. He led the villagers in prayer, reminded them of the sacraments, and often kept records of who owed what to whom. For peasants, the priest was both close and distant. He lived among them, yet spoke words of a higher world. His robes, his books, and his rituals marked him as different. Still, he was essential, for without him the sacraments, the very gates to heaven, could not be opened. The ritual calendar. Faith was woven into the calendar of the year. The church determined when to fast, when to feast, and when to rest. Sundays were holy, a day of worship and respite from labor. Beyond that, dozens of feast days punctuated the year, marking saints, holy days, and the great seasons of Christmas and Easter. During Lent, villagers fasted, eating simpler meals and abstaining from meat. At Easter, joy burst forth with processions, feasts, and the ringing of bells. At Christmas, the birth of Christ was celebrated with candles, carols, and gatherings. Each season of the farming year was tied to the church's blessing. Seeds were sown with prayers. Harvest was gathered with thanksgiving. Even storms and droughts were interpreted through faith, punishment, warning, or trial from God. Baptism, marriage, and death. Every major milestone of life passed through the church. A newborn was carried to the font for baptism, washed clean of original sin and welcomed into the Christian family. Without baptism, it was feared, a soul could not enter heaven. Marriage, too, was blessed by the priest, binding couples in the eyes of God. Though families often arranged matches, the church sanctified them, ensuring they were holy unions. Finally, death brought villagers back to the churchyard. The priest prayed over the dead, the bell tolled, and the body was laid in consecrated ground. Headstones or wooden crosses marked the graves, surrounding the church with a community of the living and the dead together. The churchyard. The church was rarely alone. Around it stretched the churchyard, a place of burial, gathering, and meeting. Graves dotted the ground, some marked with stone, others unmarked, slowly sinking back into the earth. Children played among the stones, shepherds rested against the walls, and villagers gathered here before and after Massachusetts. The churchyard was a place of life as much as of death. Fairs and markets were sometimes held here, for the shadow of the church lent protection to the goods and the people who came. Saints and relics. The medieval imagination was filled with saints. Each village might claim a special patron saint, whose feast day was celebrated with processions, prayers, and festivals. Statues of saints stood in niches, painted and sometimes dressed in robes, their images familiar to every child. Relics, bones, cloth, or objects connected to holy figures were especially powerful. Even a small relic, said to belong to a saint, brought honor and pilgrims to a church. For peasants, to kneel before a relic was to touch something beyond this world, a channel of divine grace. Festivals and holy days. The high points of the year were the great festivals. These days, ordinary work was set aside. Villagers dressed in their best clothing, bells rang out, and processions wound through the streets. Candles flickered in the church, songs filled the air, and feasting followed. These festivals were not only religious. They were social, binding the community together. They offered joy in the midst of labor, light in the midst of hardship. For many, they were the happiest days of the year. Fear and awe. Faith was not only comfort. It was also scary. The teachings of the church reminded peasants of sin, judgment, and the possibility of eternal damnation. Sermons warned of hell, paintings depicted devils, and confessions reminded people of their faults. The church held authority not only in hope but also in fear. Obedience was expected, and sin was punished. Yet even in this fear, there was a sense of order. The church explained the world, gave reasons for suffering, and promised a path to salvation. Education through faith. For most peasants, the church was the only place they encountered learning. Few could read, but the walls of the church taught through images. Painted frescoes told stories of the Bible, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, the life of Christ. Stained glass glowed with saints and miracles. Through sermons, prayers, and songs, villagers learned the truths of their faith. The church was their book, their teacher, and their guide. The church as community. Above all, the church was where the village came together. Every Sunday, neighbors stood side by side, rich and poor alike, united in prayer. News was shared, disputes settled, and bonds renewed. The church was not simply a place to visit once a week. It was the heart of the village, the point around which life revolved. Its bell was the voice of the community, and its rituals gave meaning to existence. Closing reflection. Inside the medieval village, faith was not a private matter. It was communal, constant, and essential. The church shaped time, marked life's milestones, and offered both hope and warning. It was the most enduring building, the most trusted authority, and the deepest comfort in a hard and uncertain world. To step into the village church was to step into the center of medieval life. Its stones held prayers whispered for centuries, its bells carried across generations, and its rituals gave structure to a world where so much was fragile. In the shadow of its walls, peasants found meaning, belonging, and a sense of eternity. Faith and the village church were not apart from daily life, they were its very heart. Markets, fairs, and trade. For the medieval peasant, life was defined by the fields, the seasons, and the steady rhythm of work. Yet, woven into this pattern were moments of excitement, color, and connection to the wider world. These were the days of markets and fairs, the times when villages opened outward, when trade linked farmers to merchants, and when people from distant places crossed paths in the heart of the countryside. Markets and fairs were more than chances to buy and sell. They were the lifeblood of medieval commerce, the centers of social gathering, and for many peasants, the rare moments when ordinary life felt transformed. For a few days, the isolation of the farm gave way to the bustle of crowds, the sound of traders calling out their wares, and the smell of foods and spices that carried the imagination beyond the village horizon. In this chapter, we will step into a medieval market square, wander among the stalls, and feel the atmosphere of trade. We will also journey into the great fairs, where merchants from across the region gathered, and explore how trade connected even the most humble peasants to far-off worlds. The village market. Not every village had a market of its own, but many were close enough to travel to one. Markets were held regularly, often once a week in a nearby town. The right to hold a market was granted by royal charter or lordly permission, and this privilege made certain town centers of activity. For peasants, market day meant waking before dawn, loading carts with surplus produce, eggs, poultry, or simple handmade goods, and walking along the dusty roads toward the market square. Families might bring butter, cheese, or wool, hoping to trade or sell for the coins they needed to pay rents and taxes. The market square was often the heart of the town. Stalls lined the open space, covered by canvas awnings. Merchants displayed their goods. Baskets of vegetables, bolts of cloth, salted fish, pottery, tools, and shoes. The air was filled with voices calling prices, bargaining, and the bleating of animals brought for sale. For the peasant, stepping into the market was to step into another world. Here, one could find goods not grown or made at home. Salt from the coast, iron tools from a smith, or even trinkets like beads and ribbons. Markets allowed peasants to exchange their labor and produce for items that made life easier, more secure, or simply more pleasant. Barter and coin. At the market, trade was not always conducted in coins. Many peasants had little money, and barter remained common. A basket of eggs might be exchanged for a small bag of salt. A side of bacon could pay for a tool. Wool might be traded for pottery or cloth. Coins, however, were increasingly important. Lords and kings demanded rents and taxes in money rather than goods, and so peasants needed to earn coins through sales. This forced them into the marketplace, where the value of their labor was transformed into silver pennies. The coin itself carried meaning. A silver penny stamped with the king's face was not only money. It was a reminder of the authority that bound together village, town, and kingdom. To hold one was to hold a piece of power, a token that linked even the poorest farmer to the realm's great economy. Goods for sale. What could a peasant expect to find at the market? The variety was wider than one might imagine. Foodstuffs, bread, cheese, butter, fish, poultry, herbs, and fruits. Some stalls offered honey, ale, or wine. Others sold salt, a precious preservative. Clothing and textiles, wool cloth, linen, ribbons, and second-hand garments. Cloth was expensive, and often peasants bought rough fabric to make clothes at home. Tools and utensils, knives, sickles, pots, pans, and wooden bowls. Animals, chickens, pigs, sheep, and sometimes cattle. Animal markets were noisy, with bleating, squealing, and clucking filling the air. Luxuries, rare items appeared even in small markets: a few spices, colorful beads, or small religious charms. These were treasured purchases, connecting peasants to distant lands. For many peasants, markets offered not only necessities but glimpses of things far beyond their everyday reach. A pinch of pepper from distant Asia or a small bronze brooch might be all they could afford, but these objects carried stories of places they would never see. The Great Fairs. While weekly markets were local, great fairs were regional or even international. These were grand events, held once or twice a year, often lasting several days or weeks. Lords or kings granted the right to hold fairs, and towns grew wealthy from them. The most famous fairs in Europe, such as those in Champagne in France, drew merchants from across the continent. English wool was traded for Flemish cloth. Italian merchants brought wine, oil, and luxury goods. Traders from the Baltic brought timber and furs. Even exotic goods like silk and spices filtered into these fairs. For a peasant, attending a great fair was both thrilling and overwhelming. Crowds surged through the streets, tents lined every corner, and the sound of multiple languages filled the air. Jugglers, musicians, and entertainers performed, adding to the sense of spectacle. Fairs were not only for trade but for celebration. They were times when business mixed with festivity, when the serious business of selling and buying merged with laughter, games, and songs. The regulation of trade. Markets and fairs were not chaotic free-for-alls. They were regulated by law. Weights and measures had to be checked, to prevent cheating. Prices were sometimes controlled. Lords or town officials collected tolls and fees from merchants for the right to trade. The church also played a role. Certain holy days were linked to fairs, and churches often benefited from the crowds who attended. Some fairs were even held within churchyards, blending commerce with sacred space. Crime was a concern, and market officials enforced order. Thieves and pickpockets worked the crowds, and disputes over prices could escalate. Yet the rules and watchful eyes of officials gave a sense of safety to the trade. The social side of markets. Beyond the goods, markets and fairs were vital social occasions. Villagers met friends and relatives, exchanged news, and arranged marriages. Musicians played, minstrels told stories, and traveling performers entertained crowds. For young people, markets were especially exciting. They offered a chance to meet others beyond their village, to glimpse fashions, to hear songs from distant places. For the elderly, markets were times to connect, to share memories, and to see the community gathered as one. Children found wonder in the sights: brightly colored ribbons, toys carved from wood, and the chance to taste sweets like honey cakes. For many, market day was the highlight of the month. Markets and the wider world. Though peasants rarely traveled far, markets and fairs connected them indirectly to distant places. The wool they sold might end up in a Flemish loom, woven into cloth for a noble. The salt they bought might have been carried from the coast by a merchant caravan. The beads or trinkets they purchased might have originated from the Mediterranean or even beyond. Through trade, the village was tied to networks stretching across Europe and, through intermediaries, even to Asia and Africa. Though peasants might never leave their parish, the goods they handled carried stories of the wider world. Entertainment at fairs. One cannot imagine a great fair without entertainment. Jugglers tossed balls and knives, acrobats performed flips, and musicians played lutes, fiddles, and drums. Storytellers recited tales of kings and heroes, while actors performed morality plays, teaching lessons through drama. Dancing was common, with villagers joining in circles, clapping and singing. Ale flowed freely, and laughter carried into the night. Though the church sometimes frowned on the excess, fairs were moments of release from the hard labor of daily life. The smell and sound of the market. To stand in the middle of a medieval market was to be surrounded by a whirlwind of sensations. The smell of fresh bread mingled with that of fish, cheese, and animals. Smoke from cooking fires drifted in the air. The cries of sellers competed with the calls of customers. One could hear haggling, laughter, music, and the bleating of sheep all at once. The ground was trampled with dirt and straw, while children darted between stalls. It was chaotic, but it was alive, a sharp contrast to the quiet of the fields. Closing reflection. For the medieval peasant, markets and fairs were windows to another world. They provided food, tools, and necessities, but also offered joy, connection, and a taste of wonder. They broke the monotony of agricultural life, weaving villagers into the fabric of a wider economy and culture. The market square and the fairground were places where life spilled beyond the narrow limits of cottage and field. Here, peasants encountered new goods, new people, and new ideas. They touched, if only for a moment, the larger world beyond their village. And when they returned home, their carts lighter but their hearts fuller, they carried back not just salt and cloth, but memories of a day when the world seemed wider, brighter, and more alive. Lords, taxes, and obligations. In the medieval village, every furrow plowed, every sheaf harvested, and every loaf baked carried with it a silent weight the obligations owed to the Lord. For the peasant, life was never entirely his or her own. It was bound within a web of duties, rents, and taxes that reached from the smallholding to the manor, from the manor to the king, and even further to the church. To understand the daily existence of the medieval peasant, one must understand this system of obligation. It was not merely a matter of survival in the fields but of navigating the expectations of those who held power. Lords, stewards, bailiffs, and priests all had claims upon the peasant's labor and produce. And through these obligations, the medieval world held together in a careful, if often heavy, balance. The manorial system. At the heart of medieval obligations was the manor. A manor was not simply the lord's house, it was the unit of land and organization that structured rural life. The manor included farmland, pastures, woodland, and the village itself. The lord of the manor might live in a stone hall or a fortified manor house. Surrounding him were the peasants' tenants who worked the land in exchange for the right to farm it. The manor was both home and institution, a miniature society governed by customs, obligations, and law. Peasants were not free in the modern sense. Many were serfs, tied to the land they worked. They could not leave without permission, nor could they sell their land. Yet, they were not slaves. They had rights to their holdings, to use common lands, and to pass their plots to their children. The lord demanded labor and dues, but he also provided protection and justice. Rents and dues. The obligations owed by peasants were many and varied. Some were in the form of rent, paid in produce, labor, or coin. Others were in the form of services, where the peasant had to work the Lord's fields a certain number of days per week. Labor services, perhaps the most burdensome, these required peasants to leave their own fields and work on the Lord's domain, the land reserved for the Lord's direct use. They plowed, sowed, harvested, and carted goods. During busy seasons like harvest, these demands could consume entire weeks. Produce rents, some peasants paid rent in kind, offering portions of their harvest a share of grain, honey, or livestock. Monetary rents, as coin became more common, many obligations were converted to money. This gave peasants flexibility but also forced them into the market economy, for they had to sell produce to raise the necessary funds. Special dues, beyond ordinary rents, peasants owed extra payments for events in the Lord's life. A tax might be demanded when the Lord's daughter married, when his son was knighted, or when he was captured in war and needed ransom. Feudal justice. The manor was also a court. Disputes among peasants, from boundary quarrels to theft, were heard before the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward. Here, obligations were enforced, fines levied, and customary rights confirmed. Attendance at the court was itself an obligation. Peasants were required to sit as jurors, to swear oaths, and to uphold the rules of the manor. These courts did not merely punish, they reinforced the customs that governed rural life. Tithes and the church. In addition to what was owed to the Lord, peasants also owed obligations to the church. The most significant was the tithe, 1/10 of all produce, set aside for the parish priest. This was not optional. To fail in one's tithe was to fail in one's duty to God and community. The tithe might be given in grain, eggs, livestock, or even labor. Special barns, called tithe barns, were built to store the vast amounts collected. The parish priest lived off this income, but much also supported the broader church. Beyond the tithe, there were offerings on holy days, payments for baptisms, marriages, and burials. Even in death, the peasant owed the church the soul scot, or death duty, was a final gift offered upon burial. Military obligations. While peasants themselves were rarely warriors, the system of lordship ultimately tied labor on the land to war. The wealth drawn from peasants enabled lords to arm knights, build castles, and ride to battle. At times, peasants might be called upon to support this system directly. They might transport supplies, repair fortifications, or even provide levies for armies. Such calls were rare but deeply disruptive, pulling men away from fields during crucial seasons. The burden of taxes. Beyond lords and church, peasants bore the weight of royal taxation. Kings, eager to fund wars or lavish courts, levied taxes on land and produce. Collectors traveled through villages, recording households and assessing dues. Perhaps the most infamous was the poll tax, a flat tax on every individual, regardless of wealth. Its unfair burden on the poor sparked anger and contributed to revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Taxes were resented, but refusal was dangerous. Royal authority reached even the smallest villages, and collectors had power to seize goods or land from defaulters. The steward and the bailiff. The Lord himself was rarely the one to oversee these obligations directly. Instead, officials managed the daily running of the manor. The steward acted as the Lord's chief officer, overseeing justice and accounts. The bailiff managed the fields, ensuring that peasants met their labor services. He could be both feared and resented, for he represented the Lord's authority in daily life. The reeve, often a peasant elected by the village, stood between villagers and the Lord's officers. He coordinated labor, collected dues, and spoke on behalf of the community, though often under pressure from both sides. Through this network of officials, the Lord's power extended into every corner of the village. Hidden taxes, the mill, the oven, the press. Obligations were not always obvious. Lords held monopolies over essential facilities. The mill, peasants were required to grind grain at the Lord's mill, paying a fee or giving a portion of their flour as toll. The oven, bread had to be baked in the Lord's oven, again for a fee. The wine or cider press. In some regions, peasants could not press grapes or apples at home but had to use the Lord's press. These monopolies ensured steady income for the Lord and reminded peasants that even the simplest act of baking bread was tied to obligation. Festive dues and hospitality. Obligations also carried a social side. On certain feast days, peasants were expected to bring gifts to the manor poultry at Christmas, eggs at Easter, or ale at harvest. These were offered as tokens of loyalty and tradition, reinforcing bonds between lord and tenant. In return, lords sometimes held feasts for tenants, offering food, drink, and entertainment. These occasions reminded peasants that while obligations were heavy, lordship was not only about taking but also about providing and protecting. The weight of custom. What made obligations particularly enduring was that they were not seen simply as law but as custom. They were woven into the rhythm of life, accepted as the way things had always been. A peasant might complain of burdens, but he also measured his rights through them. The right to use common pastures, to gather wood in the forest, or to fish in streams was tied to the same customs that bound him to pay rents and dues. Obligation and privilege were two sides of the same coin. Resentment and resistance. Yet, burdens could become too great. Famines, wars, and plagues strained the system. When obligations pressed harder than survival allowed, peasants resisted. Sometimes they appealed to lords for relief, asking for rents to be reduced in hard years. Sometimes they broke the rules, grinding grain secretly at home or brewing ale without permission. At times, resentment boiled over. Rebellions, such as the Jacquerie in France or the Peasants' Revolt in England, showed how deeply peasants could resent the weight of obligations. Though most revolts were crushed, they forced change and revealed the limits of lordly power. The balance of protection. For all their weight, obligations were not only chains. In theory, the Lord provided protection in return. His manor was a refuge in times of war. His knights defended the village against raiders. His justice kept disputes from turning to chaos. This balanced protection in exchange for service lay at the heart of medieval society. Though unequal, it created bonds of loyalty and dependence that endured for centuries. A peasant's year of obligation. To grasp the reality of obligations, one can imagine a single peasant household through the course of a year. In spring, they owed plowing days on the Lord's domain. In summer, they joined harvest teams, cutting and binding sheaves for the Lord's barns before tending their own. At Michaelmas, they delivered rent in grain. At Christmas, they brought poultry as a festive due. Throughout the year, they paid tithes to the church, baked bread in the Lord's oven, and ground grain at his mill. When the king demanded a tax, they scraped together coin, selling surplus produce at market. By year's end, much of their labor and produce had flowed upward to Lord, King, and Church. What remained was survival. Closing reflection. The medieval peasant lived under a web of obligations that shaped every day of life. Lords, stewards, priests, and kings all had claims upon their labor. To modern eyes, the burden may seem unbearable, yet within it was a system that bound society together. Obligations were heavy, but they provided order. They were resented, but they were also accepted. They limited freedom, but they also offered security. For the peasant, life was not entirely his own, yet it was through fulfilling these duties that he secured his place in the world. To live in the village was to live within this balance, between burden and protection, between duty and survival, between lord and tenant. And in that balance, the medieval countryside endured. Childhood, family, and growing up in the village. Life in the medieval village was not only about labor in the fields, obligations to the manor, and the daily struggle for food. It was also about family, about raising children who would one day take on the same burdens, continue the same traditions, and keep the fragile thread of survival unbroken. Childhood in a peasant household was short, often harsh, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the land. Yet even amid hardship, there was laughter, play, and the small joys that made existence bearable. This chapter will trace the journey of medieval childhood from the moment of birth, through the uncertain early years, into work and apprenticeship, and finally into marriage and adulthood. Alongside it, we will see how families functioned, how generations lived under one roof, and how a village shaped the destiny of its youngest members. Birth and uncertainty. To be born in a medieval village was to enter a world fraught with danger. Childbirth itself was perilous, with many women losing their lives during labor. The survival of infants was far from guaranteed. Disease, malnutrition, and lack of medical knowledge meant that many children never lived to see their 5th birthday. When a child was born, it was a moment of both joy and anxiety. Midwives, often older women of the village, assisted in the delivery. Their knowledge came not from formal training but from experience, passed down through generations. Herbs might be used to ease pain, charms whispered to protect mother and child from evil spirits, prayers offered to saints for safe passage into life. If the infant survived the first critical days, baptism followed swiftly. To peasants, baptism was more than a religious ritual, it was protection, an assurance that the child's soul belonged to God should death come early. Without it, families feared that the spirit would wander restlessly, denied entrance to heaven. Thus, even when parents were exhausted or poor, the journey to the village church with the newborn was treated as urgent. Early childhood, a fragile beginning. The first years of life were the most dangerous. Hunger, poor sanitation, and infections constantly threatened the youngest. Babies were swaddled in cloth, kept close to the hearth during colder months, and carried on their mother's back or hip while she worked. Mothers nursed when they could, but malnutrition in the mother often meant little milk. In such cases, thin porridges or bread soaked in broth might be given far earlier than was safe. Despite dangers, these early years were not devoid of care or tenderness. Infants were cradled, sung to, and soothed with lullabies that had been sung for centuries. Small wooden toys, carved by fathers or older brothers, offered play. Sometimes a rag doll, stuffed with scraps of cloth or straw, would be made for a girl. Childhood laughter could still be heard in the cottages, even in poverty. Growing into responsibility. Childhood in the medieval village was short. By the age of 5 or 6, children began to take on small tasks. A young boy might be sent to scare birds from the fields, or to help herd geese. A girl might fetch water, gather firewood, or watch over younger siblings. Work was gradually introduced, not as a punishment, but as a natural extension of family life. Play and labor often blended together. A child tasked with watching sheep would also carve sticks, sing songs, or play games with other children nearby. Village paths and open spaces became playgrounds with games of tag, simple ball games made from stitched cloth, or contests of strength and balance. Yet at the sound of a parent's call, play ended, and duties resumed. By age 7, expectations increased. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, learning to plow, sow, and harvest. Girls shadowed their mothers in the kitchen, learning to bake bread, spin wool, and mend clothing. Skills were taught by watching and repeating, by doing rather than listening. Every child absorbed knowledge through daily life, preparing for the day when they would run their own household. Family structure. Generations under one roof. The medieval peasant household was rarely just parents and children. It often included grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even unrelated laborers who shared space. One-room cottages housed large families. Privacy was non-existent. Children grew up surrounded by adults, absorbing their conversations, stories, and quarrels. Grandparents played important roles in raising children. An older man too weak for the fields might guard livestock or tell stories by the hearth. An elderly woman might mind infants while their mother worked. This intergenerational closeness gave children a sense of identity rooted not only in their immediate family but in the extended kinship web of the village. Discipline and obedience. In a world where survival was difficult, discipline was strict. Children were expected to obey their elders without question. Disobedience risked not only punishment but also shame within the community. Physical discipline was common, though balanced by affection. A father might scold or strike a boy who shirked his chores, but he would also teach him patiently how to plow a straight furrow. A mother might sharply rebuke a daughter for wasting bread, but later show her how to mend a cloak with pride. The church reinforced obedience. Priests preached about the importance of honoring parents and maintaining order within the family. Disobedience was framed not only as a household issue but as a sin. From a young age, children were reminded that their behavior reflected on their family and their village as a whole. Education, rare but possible. Formal schooling for peasant children was rare. Most never learned to read or write, their education consisting instead of practical skills. Yet in some villages near monasteries or larger towns, boys might be sent to learn letters from a priest, especially if destined for church service. A few bright boys, if noticed by the clergy, might rise beyond peasant life, entering the monastery or serving as scribes. For most, however, knowledge was oral. Proverbs, stories, and religious teachings were memorized and repeated. Children learned the calendar of saints' days, the cycles of planting and harvest, and the lore of weather and seasons. Even without books, knowledge was passed down reliably, ensuring that the next generation could carry on village life. Adolescence, crossing into adulthood. By the early teens, a child was no longer considered a child. Boys of 14 or 15 were expected to work alongside men, plowing, harvesting, or laboring on the Lord's land. Girls of the same age were already capable of managing a household, spinning, weaving, and cooking with competence. Adolescence was brief, often no more than a few years. Marriage could come early, especially for girls, who were sometimes wed in their mid-teens. Boys married later, often in their early 20s, once they could provide for a household. Courtship was simple, often practical. Families arranged unions to secure land, labor, or alliances within the village. Romantic notions existed in songs and stories but were rarely the deciding factor in peasant marriages. Play, festivals, and childhood joy. Despite the heavy responsibilities, medieval children did experience joy and freedom. Festivals and feast days gave opportunities for play. On holidays, games, music, and dancing filled the village green. Boys competed in wrestling matches or mock sword fights with wooden sticks. Girls danced in circles, sang songs, or played at household tasks in imitation of their mothers. Seasonal traditions gave children special delights. In spring, they might gather flowers for May Day celebrations. In autumn, after harvest, they would feast alongside adults, enjoying rare treats of roasted apples or honey cakes. In winter, stories told by the fire carried them into worlds of saints, heroes, and mythical beasts. These moments, though fleeting, provided balance. They reminded both children and adults that life was not only toil but also community, laughter, and hope. Loss and resilience. Yet childhood in the medieval village was shadowed by loss. Many children did not survive past infancy, and nearly every family experienced the death of a child. Disease swept through villages without warning, taking the young most easily. For parents, grief was constant, yet life demanded resilience. Children who grew up in such a world became accustomed early to death. Funerals were familiar, prayers for the dead routine. Yet this harsh reality also deepened bonds within families. Surviving children were cherished, their lives valued all the more for their fragility. Coming of age. The transition from child to adult was marked not by a single ceremony but by assumption of responsibility. A boy who could guide oxen in the field, or a girl who could bake bread without help, was recognized as grown. Marriage formalized adulthood, but in practice, the community acknowledged maturity long before. By the time a young man or woman stood before the altar, exchanging vows, they had already lived a lifetime of work, discipline, and preparation. Their childhood had been short, filled with duties and challenges, but also shaped by the closeness of family and village. Conclusion: childhood in the village. Growing up in a medieval village was a mixture of hardship and warmth, of responsibility and fleeting joys. Children were never sheltered from the realities of life. From birth, they were surrounded by labor, hunger, faith, and death. Yet they also experienced laughter, community, and the enduring strength of family. To be a child in the medieval world was to grow up fast, to learn quickly, and to carry the weight of survival from an early age. But it was also to belong to a household, to a village, and to a tradition that stretched back generations. In the end, the children of the village ensured its future, carrying forward the same patterns of life that their parents and grandparents had lived before them. Festivals, music, and storytelling. The rhythm of medieval life was often harsh. Days were spent in toil, bound by the rising and setting of the sun, dictated by the demands of the land and the obligations owed to lords and church alike. Yet amid the hardship, there were moments of reprieve, days when the ordinary cycle of labor gave way to celebration, when music echoed across the village green, and when the power of stories transformed the cold walls of cottages into halls of wonder. Festivals, music, and storytelling were the heartbeats of the medieval village's spirit, lifting weary souls above the grind of daily existence and weaving the bonds of community ever tighter. In this chapter, we explore how peasants celebrated, sang, and told stories, and how these cultural threads not only gave joy but also preserved history, morality, and hope for generations. The calendar of festivals. Medieval peasants measured their year not only by planting and harvest but also by the church calendar, which dictated the cycle of feast days, saints' days, and holy observances. For villagers, these festivals were the rare days of respite from backbreaking labor. They were eagerly anticipated, woven with both religious devotion and communal merriment. The most important of these celebrations were Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, but the year was also studded with dozens of minor feasts. Every saint had his or her day, and many villages held their own local festivals tied to the patron saint of their parish church. Some festivals were solemn, marked with fasting and prayer. Others erupted into joyous music, dancing, and feasting that could last for several days. Even the agricultural calendar aligned with these festivals. May Day celebrations coincided with the arrival of spring, the Feast of Lammas with the first harvest of grain, and Michaelmas with the end of the farming year. In this way, the sacred calendar and the natural world intertwined, reinforcing the sense that both faith and survival moved in harmony. Christmas in the village. Christmas, though far simpler than the modern version, was still one of the most beloved feasts. It marked not only the birth of Christ but also the darkest and coldest time of the year, when light and warmth were most desperately needed. In villages, preparations began with Advent weeks of anticipation, prayer, and occasional fasting. When Christmas Day arrived, villagers crowded into the parish church, the nave filled with candles and greenery. The service was long, with readings, hymns, and solemnity. But once the sacred observance was complete, merriment followed. Families shared what food they could: roasted meats if fortunate, or thick stews and bread if poor. Ale flowed, songs were sung, and neighbors visited one another, exchanging small tokens such as baked goods or crafted trinkets. Children looked forward to simple treats: an apple, a piece of honey cake, or perhaps a small toy carved from wood. For the adults, Christmas was not only joy but relief. The hardest part of winter lay ahead, but for a few days, community and warmth gave strength. Easter and the promise of renewal. If Christmas was a feast of warmth in the cold, Easter was a celebration of life and renewal. Falling in spring, it aligned with the rebirth of the fields, the sprouting of crops, and the return of longer days. Easter services were among the most elaborate, with villagers often dressing in their best garments, some even donning flowers or fresh greenery as symbols of new life. Fasting during Lent made the Easter feast all the more joyful. Eggs, which had been forbidden during Lent, became central to the celebration. Families painted or decorated eggs, sometimes with simple dyes made from plants, and shared them as gifts. Meat, dairy, and sweet breads returned to the table after weeks of absence. Children especially delighted in Easter traditions, running games with eggs or chasing each other in playful contests. For the adults, Easter was not only a spiritual renewal but a marker that the fields must be tended once again. Village fairs, trade meets celebration. Beyond religious feasts, one of the most anticipated events was the village fair. These were usually tied to a saint's feast day or granted by a lord as a rite, allowing markets and festivities to unfold. For peasants who rarely traveled beyond their village, the fair was a dazzling spectacle. Merchants from distant towns arrived with goods rarely seen in rural life: brightly dyed fabrics, pottery, metal tools, trinkets, and sometimes exotic spices. Stalls were set up along the green, voices calling out their wares, bargaining and laughter filling the air. But fairs were not only about trade. They were about entertainment. Jugglers, musicians, acrobats, and storytellers all performed, drawing crowds. Games of strength and chance were played, wrestling matches, archery contests, dice games, and more. Alehouses overflowed, and the entire village seemed transformed from its daily seriousness into a place of revelry. For children, the fair was pure wonder. To see brightly colored ribbons, hear new songs, or taste sweetmeats was to step into another world, if only for a day. For adults, the fair was a chance to buy necessities, to meet neighbors from nearby villages, and to experience a break from monotony. The music of village life. Music was the constant companion of medieval villagers. It was heard not only on feast days but in daily life. Work songs echoed across the fields, keeping time as men swung their sickles or women turned the soil. Lullabies soothed children in smoky cottages. Hymns rose within the church walls. Instruments, though simple, were treasured. A shepherd might play a wooden flute, filling the air with haunting melodies as sheep grazed. Minstrels passing through with fiddles or bagpipes introduced lively tunes that children remembered and hummed for weeks after. Drums, tambourines, and simple harps added rhythm and depth to village celebrations. Singing was even more common than instruments. Entire groups of villagers would join in chants or songs, especially during festivals. Carols, ballads, and drinking songs echoed in taverns and across greens. Songs preserved stories, carried news, and offered humor, often laced with wit and satire aimed at lords, clergy, or neighbors. Dancing, joy in movement. Where music lived, so too did dance. On feast days and at weddings, the village green is filled with circles of dancers. Holding hands, peasants moved in simple steps, repeating patterns to the rhythm of drums or the strumming of a lute. Dance was communal, inclusive of all ages. Children joined with elders, laughter mingling with music. Courtly dances of the nobility were complex, but village dances were simple, exuberant, and joyful. They were not performances for an audience but participation in shared happiness. Storytelling by the fire. When the day's work ended, when darkness fell and families huddled close to the hearth, storytelling also preserved history. Children learned of battles, plagues, or great storms through the words of grandparents. Even the gossip of the day could be woven into tales, turning events into parables or humorous anecdotes. The power of storytelling lay not only in the words but in the sense of belonging it gave. To listen was to connect with ancestors, to share in a tradition older than any living memory. Minstrels and wandering performers. Occasionally, the village was visited by wandering entertainers, minstrels, troubadours, or jongleur. These figures brought with them the wider world. They told stories of distant lands, sang of noble knights and fair ladies, and performed tricks that dazzled children. Their songs and tales connected the village to a broader culture, reminding peasants that there was life beyond their fields. Though most villagers would never travel far, through the minstrel's voice they could imagine castles, courts, and crusades. Festivals as social glue. Beyond joy and entertainment, festivals and storytelling served deeper purposes. They bound the community together. In a world of hardship, moments of collective laughter and shared song reminded villagers of their unity. Feasting together reinforced bonds of kinship and neighborliness. Festivals also helped reinforce the social order. Lords often sponsored celebrations, reminding peasants of their authority while also showing generosity. The church, too, used festivals to maintain devotion, blending sacred ritual with popular joy. Children who grew up in this culture absorbed its values through celebration. The songs they learned, the dances they joined, the stories they heard all shaped their sense of identity and belonging. The fragile balance. It is important to remember that even festivals were not guaranteed. Famine, plague, or war could silence music, cancel fairs, or leave villagers too weak to dance. Yet the very return of celebration after hardship was a testament to resilience. Festivals might be delayed, but they were never abandoned entirely. To sing and tell stories was as necessary as bread, for without joy, survival lost its meaning. Conclusion: the music of the peasant soul. Festivals, music, and storytelling formed the soul of medieval village life. They broke the monotony of toil, brought warmth in times of cold, and carried voices of generations across centuries. To the villagers, they were not luxuries but essentials, reminder that beyond hunger and labor, life held beauty, laughter, and meaning. The peasant's world was narrow in geography but vast in imagination. Within the ring of cottages and fields, they carried worlds of saints and heroes, melodies of joy and sorrow, and the communal life in the medieval village was shaped by the rhythms of the seasons, the authority of the church, and the demands of survival. Yet within that framework, the most intimate and profound moments of human experience unfolded: love, courtship, and marriage. For the peasant, marriage was not only a personal union but also an economic necessity, a social expectation, and a spiritual bond sanctified by the church. Love in this world was a complex mixture of affection, duty, and strategy, lived out in humble cottages and beneath the watchful gaze of neighbors. In this chapter, we step into the world of village romance. We hear the laughter of young men and women at the May Day dances, the hushed whispers at the edge of fields, the solemn vows exchanged before the altar, and the joys and sorrows of married life that followed. Through their stories, we see how the medieval peasants' experience of love and family life was both timelessly human and profoundly shaped by the conditions of their world. The social importance of marriage. In the medieval village, marriage was more than the joining of two individuals. It was the cornerstone of family life, the means by which property and land use were arranged, and the way community stability was maintained. The church insisted that marriage was a sacred sacrament, a lifelong union before God. Lords and local authorities also recognized its value, for married couples provided stable households that could work the land, raise children, and pay dues. Remaining unmarried into old age was rare, especially for women. Marriage provided protection, economic support, and the social respectability necessary in tightly knit communities. For men, marriage meant help in managing the household, raising children, and keeping the family line alive. To be married was to belong, both to one's family and to the larger social fabric. The role of the church. The medieval church exerted immense influence over marriage. Priests taught that marriage was not to be entered lightly. It required mutual consent, solemn vows, and ideally the blessing of the parish. By the 12th century, church law had firmly established that a valid marriage was based on the free will of the man and woman, not solely on parental arrangement, though in practice family approval remained crucial. Weddings typically took place at the door of the church. The priest would bless the couple and hear their vows, after which the couple would step inside for Massachusetts rings might be exchanged if the family could afford one, though for many peasants, the exchange of vows itself was the binding act. Once completed, the union was recognized as indissoluble, a bond broken only by death. Parental influence and arranged matches. While church law emphasized mutual consent, in practice, families wielded strong influence over marriage choices. Parents often arranged matches to strengthen ties. With neighbors, secure access to land, or settle debts. Land was the most precious resource in the village, and marriage negotiations often involved questions of inheritance and dowry. A bride typically brought a dowry, not always money, but perhaps livestock, household goods, or a parcel of land. A groom was expected to provide a home, either within his family's dwelling or in a new cottage built with the help of relatives. In poorer families, the negotiations were modest, but they carried deep significance, ensuring the new couple had at least the minimum needed to survive. Yet within these practical arrangements, affection could still bloom. Many young men and women had known each other since childhood, having grown up together in the same fields and attended the same church. A marriage might be arranged, but it was not devoid of emotion. In fact, villages buzzed with whispered rumors, flirtations, and romances that shaped how matches were ultimately made. Youth and courtship rituals. Courtship in the medieval village was marked by rituals, customs, and playful interactions that allowed young people to signal affection within the watchful eyes of their community. One of the most famous opportunities for courtship came with the May Day celebrations. On the 1st of May, young men and women gathered to celebrate the return of spring. They danced around the maypole, wove garlands of flowers, and sang songs that hinted at romance. Pairings formed during these festivals sometimes blossomed into marriages, for the light-hearted atmosphere gave young people space to express attraction more freely. Village dances and fairs also provided opportunities for flirtation. A young man might offer a ribbon or a small carved trinket to a girl he admired. She might accept, wearing it in her hair, or return it if uninterested. Songs and jokes carried subtle meanings, often teasing young couples into acknowledging their affection. Even everyday life provided moments of intimacy. A young man might linger to help a girl draw water from the well, or a young woman might share food with a man during harvest work. Such gestures, though small, carried weight in the tight-knit village world where nothing went unnoticed. Tokens of love. Expressions of love often came through simple gifts. A man might carve a wooden spoon, a whistle, or a small figurine to present to the girl he favored. A woman might sew a piece of cloth, embroider a kerchief, or weave a garland of flowers. These tokens, humble though they were, carried immense symbolic value. Songs also served as expressions of affection. Young men sang ballads beneath the windows of their beloved, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. The lyrics could be romantic, humorous, or even slyly suggestive. Such serenades were both a declaration of feeling and a form of entertainment for the community, as neighbors often listed betrothal and engagement. Once two families agreed upon a match, a betrothal was arranged. This was a formal promise to marry, often sealed with an exchange of gifts or tokens. Sometimes a small ceremony was held, with witnesses present to ensure the agreement was binding. The betrothal period could last months or even a year, during which time the couple was recognized as engaged. Breaking an engagement was considered a serious matter, especially if gifts had been exchanged or dowries promised. In some cases, disputes over broken betrothals even ended up in ecclesiastical courts. During the engagement, couples continued to see one another, though chastity before marriage was strongly emphasized by the church. In reality, village life was filled with temptations, and evidence suggests that premarital intimacy was not uncommon, especially if marriage was already promised. In cases where a pregnancy occurred, families often hastened the wedding to legitimize the union. The wedding day. A peasant wedding was both a sacred ceremony and a communal celebration. On the appointed day, the couple gathered at the church door, surrounded by family, neighbors, and friends. The priest asked for their vows, ensuring both consented freely. Rings, if available, were exchanged, though many couples sealed their vows simply with clasped hands and blessings. After the ceremony, the couple entered the church for Mass, offering prayers for their new life together. From there, the festivities began. The village green is filled with music, dancing, and feasting. Ale flowed freely, and neighbors contributed food, from roasted meats to loaves of bread and jugs of milk. The merriment could last well into the night, with laughter, songs, and games celebrating not only the couple but the entire community. Marriage and the household. Once married, the couple established their household. Sometimes they moved into a corner of the groom's family home, sharing space with parents and siblings. Other times, especially if the families had some means, a small cottage was built. The household was the basic unit of survival, a partnership in which both husband and wife labored to keep food on the table and children clothed. Marriage was both a partnership and a hierarchy. Husbands held legal authority, but wives managed the household, prepared food, cared for children, and often worked alongside men in the fields. The relationship was pragmatic, survival required cooperation, and affection often grew deeper through shared labor and hardship. Love and affection in marriage. While many marriages were arranged for practical reasons, affection and even deep love often flourished within them. Husbands and wives shared the struggles of survival, leaned on one another during famine and illness, and celebrated together during times of plenty. Laughter in the evenings, whispered conversations by the fire, and the joy of raising children bound couples closely. Of course, not all marriages were happy. Domestic strife, infidelity, or abuse occurred, though the church and community often stepped in to mediate. But in countless cottages, love endured, expressed not in grand gestures but in the quiet constancy of care, a husband fetching wood for the fire, a wife saving the best morsel of food for her husband after a hard day in the fields. Fertility and family life. Marriage was closely tied to fertility. Children were not only a blessing but a necessity, ensuring the continuation of the household and providing labor for the farm. A large family could be both a burden and a safeguard, as children meant more mouths to feed but also more hands to work. The church encouraged openness to children, condemning practices that prevented conception. Miscarriage, infant mortality, and childhood illness were tragically common, and many parents experienced grief alongside joy. Still, the birth of a child was celebrated with warmth and hope, reinforcing the importance of marriage as the foundation of life itself. The role of community in marriage. Marriage was never a purely private matter. The entire village played a role in celebrating, witnessing, and sometimes policing marital unions. Neighbors attended weddings, offered gifts of food or labor, and participated in feasts. Disputes between husband and wife could quickly become the subject of gossip, with community elders or priests intervening when necessary. This communal aspect gave marriage both weight and protection. To marry was to step into a role recognized and supported by the entire community, a role that carried rights, responsibilities, and expectations. Forbidden loves and scandals. Not all love followed the expected path. There were stories of forbidden romances, secret liaisons, and scandals that rocked villages. Sometimes a young couple defied their parents' wishes, running off together or refusing arranged matches. Others engaged in affairs, risking the wrath of the church and the disapproval of neighbors. Such cases were rare but memorable, becoming tales retold for generations. They served both as cautionary stories and as proof that human passion could not always be contained by custom. Conclusion: love in the fields and cottages. Love, courtship, and marriage in the medieval village were shaped by duty, faith, and survival. Yet within those constraints, human hearts beat with the same desires, affections, and sorrows that echo through time. Young men and women still gazed longingly at one another across the village green, still whispered promises in the shadows, and still felt the thrill of a wedding day. Marriage was not only about survival, it was about companionship. In the laughter of a May Day dance, in the shared labor of the harvest, in the tenderness of raising children, love found its way into the lives of peasants. Their marriages were not always perfect, but they were real, forged in the fires of necessity and sustained by the bonds of community and faith. For the medieval villagers, love was not a luxury, it was woven into the very fabric of life, as enduring as the fields they tilled and as sacred as the church that blessed their union. Death, burial, and the afterlife. Death was as much a part of medieval life as birth, labor, and the turning of the seasons. For the peasants of the village, it was not a distant concept but an ever-present reality, woven into the fabric of daily existence. Life expectancy was short compared to modern standards, many did not live beyond their 40s, and childhood itself was fragile, with illnesses, accidents, and hunger claiming many before they reached adulthood. To live in a medieval village was to walk always with death nearby, sometimes feared, sometimes accepted, and always understood as inevitable. In this chapter, we will move calmly and step by step into how medieval peasants faced death. The moment it came, the rituals of burial, the role of the church, and the beliefs that shaped their view of what awaited after life had ended. It will be neither sensational nor grim, but rather a thoughtful exploration of how ordinary people in the Middle Ages prepared for, responded to, and made meaning from the certainty of mortality. The presence of death in daily life. A medieval peasant did not need to be reminded of death's closeness, it was visible all around them. Disease often spreads quickly through villages with little means of stopping it. Accidents in the fields, injuries from tools or animals, and the ever-present risk of famine meant that survival was always uncertain. Infants and young children were the most vulnerable, with many families losing several before any reached adulthood. Yet, despite this closeness, medieval peasants did not live in constant despair. Instead, they developed a cultural and spiritual framework that allowed them to accept death as a natural passage. The church taught that earthly life was only a brief stage before eternity, and so the afterlife, whether in heaven, purgatory, or hell, was considered the true destination of the soul. This belief shaped how people responded to the deaths of loved ones and how they prepared for their own. The moment of dying. When a villager fell gravely ill, the family gathered around the bed. Cottages were small, often a single room for the entire household, so death happened not in private but in the presence of kin. The hearth fire might burn low while the sick person lay upon a straw mattress or wooden frame, wrapped in blankets or furs if they could be spared. Neighbors and relatives came to visit, both to offer comfort and to witness the passing. It was common for the dying to confess sins to the village priest if one could be summoned in time. Confession and the last rites known as extreme function were vital, for they prepared the soul to leave the world and enter the next. Without them, there was fear that the soul would wander or face judgment without absolution. The family often kept vigil through the night, praying softly, reciting familiar psalms, or repeating the Lord's Prayer. Children might watch silently, absorbing the reality that this was part of life. Death was not hidden from them, it was something they would inevitably experience and later endure themselves. When death finally came, it was marked not by silence but by ritual. The family would close the eyes of the deceased, sometimes binding the jaw with cloth so it remained shut. The body was laid out carefully, the head often turned toward the east, the direction of Jerusalem and the coming of Christ. Washing and preparing the body. Once death was certain, the body was washed. This task was usually carried out by women of the household or by designated women in the village who were known for this work. Warm water was brought to the bedside, and the body was carefully cleaned, both as a sign of respect and to prepare it for burial. Clean linen was used to wrap or dress the deceased. Poor families might not have much to spare, but even simple cloth was considered honorable. If the family could afford it, the body was placed in a wooden coffin, though many were buried simply in a shroud. Shoes and belts were often removed, it was believed the soul would travel without earthly possessions. The body would then be laid out in the cottage for a wake. Candles were lit, prayers were spoken, and neighbors came to pay their respects. Some brought food or drink for the mourners, for grief was exhausting and life had to continue. Children moved quietly among the adults, watching and learning. For them, this was an education in both community and mortality. The role of the church. The church was central in every aspect of death. The village priest guided the family in prayers, conducted the funeral service, and oversaw the burial. The funeral mass, if it could be said, was believed to aid the soul's journey. Bells rang from the small church tower, their sound carrying across the fields, reminding everyone that one of their own had passed. Funerals were usually held quickly, often within a day or two of death. Without modern preservation methods, waiting longer was difficult. The body was carried on a wooden bier, often by neighbors, from the cottage to the churchyard. The procession was slow and solemn, accompanied by prayers and hymns. For the peasants, the churchyard was not a distant place but part of their daily landscape. They passed it often, worked fields nearby, and sometimes grazed animals just beyond its stone walls. To bury the dead in consecrated ground was essential, for it ensured the soul rested under the protection of the church. Burial in the churchyard. Most peasants were buried in simple graves, dug by hand in the churchyard. Wealthier villagers or local gentry might afford marked stones or crosses, but most graves were unmarked, remembered only by family and community. Over time, as space was limited, graves might be reused after many years, the older remains respectfully moved aside. The priest blessed the ground, recited prayers, and sprinkled holy water. The family stood close, watching as the earth was filled in. Tears were shed, but there was also a deep sense of acceptance. Death was not unexpected, it was part of the cycle everyone shared. Flowers, if in season, might be placed upon the grave. In some regions, evergreen branches symbolized eternal life. Small tokens could be left, though peasants rarely had much to spare. What mattered most was the prayer and the presence of the community. Mourning and memory. After the burial, life continued quickly. The demands of the fields and animals did not pause for grief. Yet mourning had its place. Widows and widowers wore darker or plainer clothing. Families remembered the dead in their prayers, especially on anniversaries or holy days. The church calendar itself was filled with moments to honor the departed, such as All Souls' Day. Stories were told around the hearth, keeping alive the memory of parents, children, and friends who had passed. For children, these stories were reminders of family bonds and examples of how to live. For adults, they were a way to preserve the presence of loved ones even as time carried them onward. The afterlife, belief and hope. Underlying all of these practices was the belief in the afterlife. Medieval peasants did not see death as an ending, but as a passage. The soul, it was taught, would face judgment, heaven for the righteous, hell for the damned, and purgatory for most a place of cleansing before entering heaven. Purgatory was particularly significant. It gave hope that even those with sins might eventually find salvation, provided prayers and masses were offered on their behalf. Families prayed diligently for their dead, believing that their devotion could ease the soul's journey. This belief tied the living and the dead together, binding generations in spiritual connection. The image of heaven was one of peace, freedom from hunger, toil, and pain. For peasants who labored endlessly in the fields, this vision of eternal rest was powerful. Hell, by contrast, was depicted in sermons and paintings as a place of fire and torment. These images were meant both to warn and to guide behavior in life. Death in times of crisis. In times of famine or plague, death became overwhelming. Graves multiplied, churchyards filled, and the rituals of mourning were sometimes shortened out of necessity. Yet even in these times, peasants sought meaning. They turned to the church for explanation, often seeing such events as divine punishment or trials of faith. The Black Death of the 14th century would leave an indelible mark on European villages, reducing populations drastically and reshaping society. But even before and after such catastrophes, smaller outbreaks of disease, poor harvests, and local hardships kept death a familiar figure in peasant life. Acceptance and continuity. For the medieval peasant, death was not an interruption of life but a continuation of the same cycle that governed the seasons, the crops, and the animals. Just as fields were sown and harvested, so too were lives begun and ended. The community carried on, sustaining itself through birth, labor, and death, bound together by faith and necessity. The certainty of death gave shape to life. It influenced decisions, guided behavior, and fostered a sense of humility before God and the world. To live well was to be prepared for death, to die well was to leave behind both memory and hope. Closing reflections. When we imagine the medieval village, it is easy to think only of toil and hardship. Yet, in their rituals around death, peasants revealed resilience, faith, and deep humanity. They faced mortality not with denial but with practices that gave structure and meaning. In the churchyard, beneath the shadow of the small village church, generations rested side by side, forming the silent foundation of the community. For the living, every passing was both a loss and a reminder, life was fleeting, and eternity awaited. Bread would be baked again, fields tilled, children born, but always with the knowledge that death would return, as constant as the seasons and as certain as the harvest. Seasons and the turning of the year. The medieval village moved to the rhythm of nature's clock. To be a peasant in the Middle Ages was to live within a world not marked by the ticking of hours or the convenience of calendars on paper, but by the turn of the earth, the light of the sun, the swell of the moon, and the breath of the seasons. Each cycle spring's renewal, summer's labor, autumn's harvest, and winter's silence dictated not only what was possible in the fields but also how life in the cottage, the church, and the village itself unfolded. In this chapter, we will walk slowly and thoughtfully through the seasons as the medieval peasant experienced them. We will see how weather and nature ruled every task, how festivals punctuated the year with joy and meaning, and how survival depended upon respecting and anticipating the eternal wheel of time. The peasant's calendar. The medieval peasant did not rely on clocks or wristwatches, and even written calendars were rare in the countryside. Instead, the year was measured by feast days, saints' days, and the great cycles of planting and harvest. The church calendar was as important as the natural one. Major festivals Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, Michaelmas, and countless local saints' days provided reference points by which peasants oriented their lives. When someone said, "We'll finish this after Michaelmas," or, "by the time of Easter," everyone knew roughly when that would be. The ringing of the church bell marked hours of prayer morning, midday, and eve. Spring, awakening of the fields. Spring was a time of hope, tension, and preparation. After the hunger of winter, when supplies had often dwindled and bellies ached for more, the first signs of green in the fields and hedgerows brought relief. In March and April, the plowman returned to the fields, guiding his oxen through heavy soils softened by the thaw. The land had to be prepared for sowing barley, oats, peas, and beans, crops that would sustain the village through the next year. Families worked side by side, with children shooing birds away from newly planted seeds and women bringing water and bread to the men in the fields. Spring also meant lambing season. Sheep, so vital for wool and manure, gave birth to fragile lambs that needed care. Calves and piglets appeared as well, adding to the sense of renewal. Religious festivals underscored this new beginning. Lent, a time of fasting and reflection, gave way to Easter, the greatest feast of the church year. The resurrection mirrored the rebirth of the earth itself, and villagers celebrated with feasting, processions, and song. But spring also carried risk. A late frost or too much rain could ruin seed and waste the peasant's effort. The uncertainty of nature was always present, reminding them that human labor could only go so far. The rest lay in God's hands. Summer, labor and growth. By June and July, the village was alive with work. Summer was not a season of leisure but of relentless labor. Weeds had to be pulled, animals tended, and meadows cut for hay. Haymaking was crucial, for without enough fodder, animals would starve in winter. Whole family reaping was done with sickles, stalk by stalk, bundle by bundle. It was slow, exhausting labor, often stretching from dawn until dusk. Families brought food into the fields to save time. Neighbors helped each other, for delay meant loss. In some places, the last sheaf of grain was treated with ritual respect, decorated, raised high, or even fashioned into a corn dolly, symbolizing the spirit of the harvest. Once gathered, the grain was threshed to separate it from the husks and stored in barns. This was the true measure of the year's success. A good harvest meant full granaries and hope of survival, a poor one meant hunger, anxiety, and sometimes death. Michaelmas, celebrated on September 29th, marked both a spiritual and practical turning point. It was a time to pay rents and obligations to the Lord, to renew labor agreements, and to take stock of provisions. The church offered prayers of thanksgiving, while villagers quietly calculated how far their supplies might stretch. Winter. Silence and survival. Winter was the season of survival. By November, fields were bare, and life moved indoors. Families huddled in cottages, the hearth their center, as winds howled outside. Tasks turned to repairing tools, spinning wool, and tending to animals in their shelters. The food was plain and repetitive. Porridge, bread, salted meat, and preserved beans or peas made up the diet. Fresh vegetables were scarce, and hunger often sharpened by January or February when supplies dwindled. The hungry months could test even the strongest families. Yet winter was also a time of gathering, storytelling, and prayer. Long evenings around the fire allowed elders to pass on tales of saints, heroes, and ancestors. Children learned songs, legends, and lessons of endurance. The rhythms of the church gave structure to otherwise empty days: Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas. Christmas was celebrated with joy, despite poverty. Even the poorest tried to save a little meat, honey, or ale for the feast. The Nativity brought warmth and hope, reminding villagers that even in darkness, light returned. The eternal cycle. Through all of this, the peasant's life was one of acceptance. The seasons came and went, beyond anyone's control. Each year brought its own variations: storms, droughts, good harvests, poor ones, yet the cycle itself never failed. Spring followed winter, summer followed spring, and autumn brought the harvest once again. This sense of repetition gave stability to a life otherwise uncertain. A child born in spring might be christened as lambs bleated outside, a marriage celebrated in summer might be blessed under long twilight skies, a burial in winter might take place in frozen earth. In every case, human life unfolded under the same turning wheel of nature and faith. Reflections. For the medieval peasant, time was not abstract. It was seen, felt, and tasted. The bite of hunger in February, the joy of green shoots in April, the sweat of haymaking in July, the relief of full barns in October. It was measured in bells, festivals, and prayers. To live in a medieval village was to know intimately that life depended upon the balance of labor, weather, and divine will. The seasons were not simply background, they were the stage, the script, and the rhythm by which all existence was played. And so the peasant accepted the eternal truth: just as the fields must rest before they can bear again, so too must human life bow to cycles of work and rest, joy and sorrow, birth and death. The wheel turned endlessly, and the medieval villager turned with it. Crime, justice, and punishment in the village. Life in the medieval village was tightly bound by shared work, faith, and dependence on neighbors, yet even within such close-knit communities, crime was never absent. Disputes over land, theft of livestock, quarrels that turned violent, or violations of custom all occurred from time to time. The village was a place of cooperation, but also of tension, where human weakness and desperation could lead to wrongdoing. In this chapter, we will walk carefully through the world of medieval crime and punishment as it touched the lives of ordinary villagers. We will see how justice was defined, who enforced it, and what punishments were carried out. We will also explore how these systems reflected not only order and authority but also fear, community memory, and deeply rooted belief in divine judgment. The nature of crime in the village. The most common crimes in medieval rural life were not grand or elaborate but practical. Theft topped the list: stealing a chicken, poaching a rabbit from the Lord's woods, taking firewood without permission, or slipping grain from another man's sack. Hunger and poverty often drove these acts. Disputes over land boundaries or grazing rights also caused endless quarrels. In a world where survival depended on narrow strips of field and access to common meadows, accusations of encroachment or trespass could escalate quickly. Violence was another familiar crime. Fistfights broke out in taverns or markets, insults between neighbors could turn to blows. Sometimes, weapons were drawn, and blood was shed. Homicide did occur, though less frequently than theft. Moral offenses, adultery, fornication, failure to attend church, or slander were also taken seriously. The church courts monitored spiritual life, while secular courts handled property and physical disputes. In both cases, crime was seen not simply as an individual fault but as a wound to the community and, ultimately, to God, who maintained order. Law in the medieval village did not operate with police in the modern sense. Instead, responsibility for order was communal. The lord's authority, the local lord held legal power over his tenants. His manor court was the primary place where disputes were aired and punishments assigned. Were unmarked, remembered only by family and community. Over time, as space was limited, graves might be reused after many years, the older remains respectfully moved aside. The priest blessed the ground, recited prayers, and sprinkled holy water. The family stood close, watching as the earth was filled in. Tears were shed, but there was also a deep sense of acceptance. Death was not unexpected, it was part of the cycle everyone shared. Flowers, if in season, might be placed upon the grave. In some regions, evergreen branches symbolized eternal life. Small tokens could be left, though peasants rarely had much to spare. What mattered most was the prayer and the presence of the community. Mourning and memory. After the burial, life continued quickly. The demands of the fields and animals did not pause for grief. Yet mourning had its place. Widows and widowers wore darker or plainer clothing. Families remembered the dead in their prayers, especially on anniversaries or holy days. The church calendar itself was filled with moments to honor the departed, such as All Souls' Day. Stories were told around the hearth, keeping alive the memory of parents, children, and friends who had passed. For children, these stories were reminders of family bonds and examples of how to live. For adults, they were a way to preserve the presence of loved ones even as time carried them onward. The afterlife, belief and hope. Underlying all of these practices was the belief in the afterlife. Medieval peasants did not see death as an ending, but as a passage. The soul, it was taught, would face judgment, heaven for the righteous, hell for the damned, and purgatory for most a place of cleansing before entering heaven. Purgatory was particularly significant. It gave hope that even those with sins might eventually find salvation, provided prayers and masses were offered on their behalf. Families prayed diligently for their dead, believing that their devotion could ease the soul's journey. This belief tied the living and the dead together, binding generations in spiritual connection. The image of heaven was one of peace, freedom from hunger, toil, and pain. For peasants who labored endlessly in the fields, this vision of eternal rest was powerful. Hell, by contrast, was depicted in sermons and paintings as a place of fire and torment. These images were meant both to warn and to guide behavior in life. Death in times of crisis. In times of famine or plague, death became overwhelming. Graves multiplied, churchyards filled, and the rituals of mourning were sometimes shortened out of necessity. Yet even in these times, peasants sought meaning. They turned to the church for explanation, often seeing such events as divine punishment or trials of faith. The Black Death of the 14th century would leave an indelible mark on European villages, reducing populations drastically and reshaping society. But even before and after such catastrophes, smaller outbreaks of disease, poor harvests, and local hardships kept death a familiar figure in peasant life. Acceptance and continuity. For the medieval peasant, death was not an interruption of life but a continuation of the same cycle that governed the seasons, the crops, and the animals. Just as fields were sown and harvested, so too were lives begun and ended. The community carried on, sustaining itself through birth, labor, and death, bound together by faith and necessity. The certainty of death gave shape to life. It influenced decisions, guided behavior, and fostered a sense of humility before God and the world. To live well was to be prepared for death, to die well was to leave behind both memory and hope. Closing reflections. When we imagine the medieval village, it is easy to think only of toil and hardship. Yet, in their rituals around death, peasants revealed resilience, faith, and deep humanity. They faced mortality not with denial but with practices that gave structure and meaning. In the churchyard, beneath the shadow of the small village church, generations rested side by side, forming the silent foundation of the community. For the living, every passing was both a loss and a reminder, life was fleeting, and eternity awaited. Bread would be baked again, fields tilled, children born, but always with the knowledge that death would return, as constant as the seasons and as certain as the harvest. Seasons and the turning of the year. The medieval village moved to the rhythm of nature's clock. To be a peasant in the Middle Ages was to live within a world not marked by the ticking of hours or the convenience of calendars on paper, but by the turn of the earth, the light of the sun, the swell of the moon, and the breath of the seasons. Each cycle, spring's renewal, summer's labor, autumn's harvest, and winter's silence dictated not only what was possible in the fields but also how life in the cottage, the church, and the village itself unfolded. In this chapter, we will walk slowly and thoughtfully through the seasons as the medieval peasant experienced them. We will see how weather and nature ruled every task, how festivals punctuated the year with joy and meaning, and how survival depended upon respecting and anticipating the eternal wheel of time. The peasant's calendar. The medieval peasant did not rely on clocks or wristwatches, and even written calendars were rare in the countryside. Instead, the year was measured by feast days, saints' days, and the great cycles of planting and harvest. The church calendar was as important as the natural one. Major festivals, Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, Michaelmas, and countless local saints' days provided reference points by which peasants oriented their lives. When someone said, "We'll finish this after Michaelmas," or, "by the time of Easter," everyone knew roughly when that would be. The ringing of the church bell marked hours of prayer, morning, midday, and eve. Spring, awakening of the fields. Spring was a time of hope, tension, and preparation. After the hunger of winter, when supplies had often dwindled and bellies ached for more, the first signs of green in the fields and hedgerows brought relief. In March and April, the plowman returned to the fields, guiding his oxen through heavy soils softened by the thaw. The land had to be prepared for sowing barley, oats, peas, and beans, crops that would sustain the village through the next year. Families worked side by side, with children shooing birds away from newly planted seeds and women bringing water and bread to the men in the fields. Spring also meant lambing season. Sheep, so vital for wool and manure, gave birth to fragile lambs that needed care. Calves and piglets appeared as well, adding to the sense of renewal. Religious festivals underscored this new beginning. Lent, a time of fasting and reflection, gave way to Easter, the greatest feast of the church year. The resurrection mirrored the rebirth of the earth itself, and villagers celebrated with feasting, processions, and song. But spring also carried risk. A late frost or too much rain could ruin seed and waste the peasant's effort. The uncertainty of nature was always present, reminding them that human labor could only go so far. The rest lay in God's hands. Summer, labor and growth. By June and July, the village was alive with work. Summer was not a season of leisure but of relentless labor. Weeds had to be pulled, animals tended, and meadows cut for hay. Haymaking was crucial, for without enough fodder, animals would starve in winter. Whole family reaping was done with sickles, stalk by stalk, bundle by bundle. It was slow, exhausting labor, often stretching from dawn until dusk. Families brought food into the fields to save time. Neighbors helped each other, for delay meant loss. In some places, the last sheaf of grain was treated with ritual respect, decorated, raised high, or even fashioned into a corn dolly, symbolizing the spirit of the harvest. Once gathered, the grain was threshed to separate it from the husks and stored in barns. This was the true measure of the year's success. A good harvest meant full granaries and hope of survival, a poor one meant hunger, anxiety, and sometimes death. Michaelmas, celebrated on September 29th, marked both a spiritual and practical turning point. It was a time to pay rents and obligations to the Lord, to renew labor agreements, and to take stock of provisions. The church offered prayers of thanksgiving, while villagers quietly calculated how far their supplies might stretch. Winter. Silence and survival. Winter was the season of survival. By November, fields were bare, and life moved indoors. Families huddled in cottages, the hearth their center, as winds howled outside. Tasks turned to repairing tools, spinning wool, and tending to animals in their shelters. The food was plain and repetitive. Porridge, bread, salted meat, and preserved beans or peas made up the diet. Fresh vegetables were scarce, and hunger often sharpened by January or February when supplies dwindled. The hungry months could test even the strongest families. Yet winter was also a time of gathering, storytelling, and prayer. Long evenings around the fire allowed elders to pass on tales of saints, heroes, and ancestors. Children learned songs, legends, and lessons of endurance. The rhythms of the church gave structure to otherwise empty days: Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas. Christmas was celebrated with joy, despite poverty. Even the poorest tried to save a little meat, honey, or ale for the feast. The Nativity brought warmth and hope, reminding villagers that even in darkness, light returned. The eternal cycle. Through all of this, the peasant's life was one of acceptance. The seasons came and went, beyond anyone's control. Each year brought its own variations, storms, droughts, good harvests, poor ones, yet the cycle itself never failed. Spring followed winter, summer followed spring, and autumn brought the harvest once again. This sense of repetition gave stability to a life otherwise uncertain. A child born in spring might be christened as lambs bleated outside, a marriage celebrated in summer might be blessed under long twilight skies, a burial in winter might take place in frozen earth. In every case, human life unfolded under the same turning wheel of nature and faith. Reflections. For the medieval peasant, time was not abstract. It was seen, felt, and tasted. The bite of hunger in February, the joy of green shoots in April, the sweat of haymaking in July, the relief of full barns in October. It was measured in bells, festivals, and prayers. To live in a medieval village was to know intimately that life depended upon the balance of labor, weather, and divine will. The seasons were not simply background, they were the stage, the script, and the rhythm by which all existence was played. And so the peasant accepted the eternal truth: just as the fields must rest before they can bear again, so too must human life bow to cycles of work and rest, joy and sorrow, birth and death. The wheel turned endlessly, and the medieval villager turned with it. Crime, justice, and punishment in the village. Life in the medieval village was tightly bound by shared work, faith, and dependence on neighbors, yet even within such close-knit communities, crime was never absent. Disputes over land, theft of livestock, quarrels that turned violent, or violations of custom all occurred from time to time. The village was a place of cooperation, but also of tension, where human weakness and desperation could lead to wrongdoing. In this chapter, we will walk carefully through the world of medieval crime and punishment as it touched the lives of ordinary villagers. We will see how justice was defined, who enforced it, and what punishments were carried out. We will also explore how these systems reflected not only order and authority but also fear, community memory, and deeply rooted belief in divine judgment. The nature of crime in the village. The most common crimes in medieval rural life were not grand or elaborate but practical. Theft topped the list: stealing a chicken, poaching a rabbit from the Lord's woods, taking firewood without permission, or slipping grain from another man's sack. Hunger and poverty often drove these acts. Disputes over land boundaries or grazing rights also caused endless quarrels. In a world where survival depended on narrow strips of field and access to common meadows, accusations of encroachment or trespass could escalate quickly. Violence was another familiar crime. Fistfights broke out in taverns or markets, insults between neighbors could turn to blows. Sometimes, weapons were drawn, and blood was shed. Homicide did occur, though less frequently than theft. Moral offenses, adultery, fornication, failure to attend church, or slander were also taken seriously. The church courts monitored spiritual life, while secular courts handled property and physical disputes. In both cases, crime was seen not simply as an individual fault but as a wound to the community and, ultimately, to God, who maintained order. Law in the medieval village did not operate with police in the modern sense. Instead, responsibility for order was communal. The lord's authority, the local lord held legal power over his tenants. His manor court was the primary place where disputes were aired and punishments assigned. The bailiff or reeve, these village officials, often chosen from among the peasants themselves, enforced rules, collected fines, and ensured labor obligations were met. Tithing system, men were grouped into tithing small bands of 10 households responsible for one another's behavior. If one man committed a crime, his neighbors were bound to bring him forward. The hue and cry, if a theft or violent act occurred, villagers were expected to raise a loud call and pursue the offender together. To ignore the hue and cry was itself punishable. Order, therefore, rested less on professional enforcement and more on community pressure. Everyone knew everyone else, and no one could disappear into anonymity. Manor courts and justice. The manor court was the heartbeat of rural justice. Held several times a year, it gathered tenants before the lord or his steward. Villagers came not only as defendants or plaintiffs but also as jurors, witnesses, and record keepers. Cases ranged from petty theft to boundary disputes, from neglecting labor duties to allowing animals to stray into others' fields. The court enforced agricultural order as much as criminal law. A man whose pigs destroyed a neighbor's crops might be fined, a woman who sold ale without the proper measure might be punished for fraud. Justice was swift and often financial. Fines were the most common penalty. Since money was scarce, fines could be heavy burdens, forcing a peasant to sell goods or pledge future labor. But beyond fines, shame was powerful. The public nature of court meant that misdeeds were remembered and repeated. A man branded a thief might never fully shake the reputation, no matter the punishment served. The role of the church courts. Alongside the manor stood the church courts, which oversaw matters of morality and spirituality. These courts dealt with sins such as adultery, gossip, heresy, failure to pay tithes, or breaking fasts. Punishments here were less physical and more penitent. Offenders might be ordered to do public penance, stand barefoot before the congregation, or make offerings to the church. In serious cases, excommunication threatened cutting a soul off from the community of faith, a fate many feared more than prison or fine. Church courts also had reached into family life. Disputes over marriage, legitimacy of children, or wills and inheritance often found their way before clerics. Thus, the village experienced two overlapping systems of law, the secular authority of the manor and the spiritual authority of the church. Punishments in the village. Punishment varied by crime and circumstance, but it always carried a message, to deter, to shame, and to restore order. Fines and forfeitures, the most common penalties. A thief might pay several shillings, or a farmer might owe compensation for damage caused by animals. Stocks and pillory, public humiliation was widely used. Offenders were locked in wooden frames in the village square, where neighbors could jeer, throw refuse, or simply stare. Whipping, for more serious or repeated offenses, whipping served as both pain and warning. It was often administered publicly. Banishment, rare but real, exile from the village was devastating, for survival depended upon belonging. Capital punishment, for crimes like murder, arson, or persistent theft, execution could occur. Hanging was the common method, sometimes carried out at a gallows just outside the village. While these punishments may seem harsh, medieval villagers often saw them as necessary to maintain fragile order in a small, dependent community. Trial by ordeal and divine judgment. In earlier centuries, some villages still practiced trial by ordeal, seeking God's judgment directly. An accused might be ordered to plunge a hand into boiling water, carry hot iron, or be bound and thrown into water. If wounds healed cleanly or the accused floated rather than sank, God was believed to have spoken. By the later Middle Ages, such practices waned, replaced by juries and testimony. Yet the idea remained that God guided justice, whether through ordeal, oath, or the conscience of those who judged. Crime as community memory. One of the most striking aspects of medieval village justice was its public, collective nature. There was little privacy in wrongdoing. Everyone knew who had quarreled, who had stolen, who had failed to show up for labor. Gossip and memory carried reputations forward for decades. Thus, punishment was not only about correcting the offender but also about warning the community. The thief in the stocks reminded others not to risk shame. The gallows at the edge of the field reminded all of the ultimate boundary. Fear, fairness, and faith. To the medieval villager, crime was never simply personal. It threatened the balance of the community and invited divine disfavor. A village that tolerated sin or violence risked God's wrath in the form of poor harvests or disaster. Justice, therefore, had cosmic weight. At the same time, justice was not always fair in modern terms. Lords and officials had more power, and peasants could suffer disproportionately. Yet within this system, villagers found ways to negotiate, appeal, or rely on neighbors' testimony. Justice was rough but functional, aimed less at rehabilitation and more at deterrence and survival. Reflections. The medieval village was not lawless, nor was it cruel beyond reason. It was a society where law was deeply interwoven with daily life, where crime was rare enough to be remembered but real enough to fear. Punishments may seem harsh to us, but to the villagers they were necessary anchors of order in a fragile world. Above all, crime and punishment reflected the values of the time, that the community mattered more than the individual, that God's judgment oversaw all human judgment. And that survival demanded rules respected by all. The village bell rang not only for prayer and feast but also for trial and punishment, reminding every man, woman, and child that justice, like the turning of the seasons, was part of the rhythm of medieval life. Medicine, healing, and folk beliefs in the village. The medieval village was a place where health and sickness shaped daily life just as much as farming, faith, or family. Villagers lived close to the soil, exposed to the seasons, hard labor, and the ever-present risk of disease. Without modern science or medicine, their understanding of illness rested on tradition, observation, and belief. Healing came from a blend of practical remedies, spiritual faith, and folk practices passed down across generations. In this chapter, we will walk carefully through the world of medicine and healing as it was known to ordinary villagers. We will see what resources they had, what they feared, and how they explained the mysteries of sickness and health. We will explore the healers who tended to them, the herbs and cures they trusted, the church's role in medicine, and the deep influence of folk beliefs that wove magic, superstition, and faith into daily care. The fragility of health in the village. Life expectancy in the medieval countryside was short by modern standards. Many children did not survive infancy. Adults lived with constant risks, accidents in the fields, epidemics sweeping through villages, or simple infections that could turn deadly. A small cut might fester, a fever might linger, and childbirth carries grave danger for both mother and child. Common ailments included fevers, coughs, stomach troubles, toothaches, joint pains, and skin diseases. Malnutrition often weakens bodies, leaving villagers vulnerable. Famine years meant not just hunger but also sickness, as weakened immune systems made people easy prey for disease. Against this backdrop, medicine was never a matter of certainty. Remedies were tried, shared, and remembered, but recovery was always uncertain, and death always near. Healers of the village. The village did not have professional doctors in the way cities sometimes did. Instead, healing came from a variety of local figures. Wise women and cunning men, these were villagers known for knowledge of herbs, charms, and remedies. They might treat fevers with plants, set broken bones, or prepare salves for wounds. Some were respected, others regarded with suspicion. Their reputation depended on success and the trust of neighbors. Barber surgeons. In larger villages or towns, barber surgeons offered services such as bloodletting, tooth pulling, or lancing boils. They carried sharp blades and a rough understanding of the body but were not scholars of medicine. Monks and priests. The church also played a role in healing. Monasteries grew herbs, copied medical texts, and provided care for the sick poor. In villages, priests might bless water, recite prayers for healing, or advise on fasting and penance to cure illness of the soul. Midwives. For childbirth, women relied on midwives. These women guided labor, delivered infants, and cared for mothers afterward. Their skills, based on experience rather than formal training, were vital in a world where childbirth was so dangerous. Healing, then, was communal, practical, and rooted in tradition more than in theory. Explanations of illness. To medieval villagers, illness was not explained in terms of germs or infection. Instead, they relied on several overlapping frameworks. Humors. From ancient tradition, illness was thought to arise when the body's four humors blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile were out of balance. Remedies often sought to restore balance through purging, bleeding, or adjusting diet. Divine will. Illness could be seen as punishment for sin or a test of faith. Healing required not only remedies but prayer, confession, or pilgrimage. Astrology. The stars and planets were believed to influence health. Some healers consulted astrological charts to decide the best time for treatments. Witchcraft and evil spirits. Some illnesses were blamed on curses or malevolent forces. Charms, amulets, and protective prayers were used to drive them away. These explanations were not contradictory but layered. A villager might bleed a patient to balance humors, pray for God's mercy, and hang a charm at the bed all at once. Herbs and remedies. Plants were the foundation of village medicine. Knowledge of herbs was practical and local, gathered through centuries of trial and error. Some commonly used remedies included willow bark for pain relief, later known to contain salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. Garlic and onion as protection against infection and as tonics for strength. Chamomile and mint to ease stomach troubles. Yarrow for staunching wounds and nosebleeds. Honey as a dressing for wounds, valued for its soothing and preservative qualities. Comfrey for broken bones, known as bone set, for its reputed ability to help healing. Herbs were prepared as teas, poultices, or ointments, often combined with ritual words or prayers. Villagers also used animal products lard, milk, eggs in remedies, and minerals such as salt or sulfur. Not all remedies were effective, of course, and some were dangerous. Yet in many cases, villagers did discover real medicinal effects, even if they could not explain them scientifically. Bloodletting and the humors. Among the most widespread practices was bloodletting. If sickness was caused by too much blood, then letting some out was believed to restore balance. A healer might open a vein with a knife, use leeches, or apply cupping. Though dangerous by modern standards, bloodletting remained popular for centuries, reinforced by the theory of humor. Even ordinary villagers were familiar with the concept, and some tried to practice it themselves in simple form. Folk beliefs and protective practices. Alongside herbs and humors, villagers turned to folk belief for healing and protection. These practices included charms and amulets. A cross, a string of beads, or a piece of iron might be carried to ward off sickness or evil spirits. Spoken charms, certain words or prayers, whispered at the right moment, were thought to carry power. Some mixed Christian prayers with older, pagan-like incantations. Holy water and relics. villagers might sprinkle holy water on the sick or seek healing from contact with saints' relics. Pilgrimages, traveling to a shrine, often carrying the sick person or a token on their behalf, was a form of seeking miraculous cure. Seasonal rituals, on certain feast days, herbs gathered at dawn were believed to hold special healing power. These practices reveal how medicine and magic blurred together in village life. What mattered most was hope, the belief that healing could come from herb, prayer, or charm. Epidemics and fear. For all their remedies, villagers were helpless against large epidemics. The most feared, of course, was the plague, which could strike with little warning and kill swiftly. But even smaller outbreaks of fevers, dysentery, or influenza could devastate a village. In times of epidemic, people turned desperately to prayer, processions, fasting, or scapegoating. Some blamed sin, others outsiders or witches. Fear was as contagious as the disease itself. Epidemics reminded villagers of their vulnerability, and also reinforced their faith that healing ultimately lay in God's hands. Childbirth and women's health. Childbirth deserves special attention, for it was both common and perilous. Midwives guided the process, offering herbs to ease pain, prayers for safe delivery, and charms for protection. Yet many mothers and infants did not survive. Women also faced health issues specific to their bodies: menstrual troubles, miscarriages, fevers after childbirth, for which remedies were passed quietly among women, outside the manor court or church. Midwives and wise women were essential, though sometimes accused of witchcraft if too successful or too independent. Healing and part of healing. To prepare a soul through confession, prayer, and the sacraments was seen as just as important as healing the body. In this way, medicine and religion intertwined. Healing was not simply about survival but about aligning body and soul with God's will. Reflections. The world of medicine and healing in the medieval village was a world of uncertainty, tradition, and faith. Remedies mixed herbs with prayers, humors with charms, and observation with superstition. Healing was not separate from daily life but woven into it, passed down in memory and ritual. While many practices would not meet modern standards, some had genuine value, and all offered comfort in a fragile world. Most importantly, they reveal how medieval villagers understood themselves, as bodies and souls bound together, living under God's watch, vulnerable to sickness but never without hope for healing. Travel, pilgrimage, and journeys beyond the village. The medieval village was a small world. Most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, their lives tied to the fields, the church, and the manor. Yet, even in this world of rootedness, movement and journeys were a reality. Roads wound through the countryside, traders came and went, and sometimes villagers themselves stepped beyond familiar boundaries. Whether for necessity, devotion, or adventure, travel formed a subtle but vital part of medieval life. In this chapter, we will explore the many kinds of journeys that shaped the lives of ordinary villagers, from short trips to local markets, to pilgrimages stretching across Europe, and even, for a few, voyages to distant lands. We will see the hardships of travel, the hopes that fueled it, the dangers along the way, and the stories of how leaving home, even briefly, expanded a villager's sense of the wider world. The world beyond the village. For most villagers, the world was the parish, the cluster of houses, fields, and the church. Beyond this lay neighboring villages, market towns, and manors belonging to other lords. Few had the means to travel far, yet everyone knew of roads, crossroads, and paths that linked one community to another. The presence of strangers reminded villagers that they were part of a larger web. Traders, peddlers, or messengers brought news of wars, rumors of kings, and tales of distant lands.